ocean's whisper calls my name. Depth and longing in my soul, seeking more than just this game. Waves crash softly at my feet, echoes in my heart so deep. Eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Echoes in my heart so deep, eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Shells and sand beneath my toes, tides reveal what ebb and flows. In the quiet still I hear whisper longings crystal clear. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Fire, depth of love beyond all dreams, in the vastness it redeems. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore.
Man, that really is a very loud, like, ending. I think I'm gonna change that because that's just loud. Oh, I was like, "Oh, dang, it wasn't that loud before." I don't know why it got louder. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. That That's fine. Sorry, that just threw me it just threw me off. Okay, give me a second. All right, everybody, welcome to In Deep Calls Deep and the joys of live streaming. It's always an adventure. For sure. We're glad that you all joined us. We had such a great response to the series so far. The last one got a lot of good comments. I got several people emailing more questions and asking me a whole bunch more about things. And most of their questions are going to be covered in this episode. So I'm really excited about this. Always happy to get the gang back together again because we just have a blast talking about some of this fun stuff. I tell you, if you want a group of people who could talk for like a week and a half straight about Leviticus, this is your group of people to hang out with right here because I think we could probably do a marathon of that and they have no problem whatsoever. So for those of you who are new and stopping by, let's go around the horn. We'll start with Spencer. Go around, introduce yourselves, and then we will jump in.
Sure. I am Spencer Owen. I am hosting the Trauma Informed Church Kid podcast. I am a licensed counselor out in Colorado, and I work with spiritual trauma and religious abuse. And I am just a huge Levitic geek nerd. So that's me.
I am Courtney Trotter. I teach Biblical Greek and Hebrew online at Kairos Classroom. We also have a few videos on our YouTube channel breaking down Greek and Hebrew verses and concepts. So if you want to check us out and see a few more videos of nerdy Greek or Hebrew, you can go there. But other than that, you can check me out if you sign up for one of our classes. We have signups going now for the fall, but if not, if you don't catch us now, you can catch us in the fall as well.
Who's next? I can go. I'm Phil Bray. I'm also a Leviticus nerd. I'm on the channel Leviticus is Fun, where I try and make short, fun videos and make Leviticus fun. I also recently wrote a book called Leviticus on the Butcher's Block. I've got it somewhere. That book. Yeah, that's me. I'm from Australia, Sydney, Australia. That's why my voice sounds weird and why it's really, really dark and cold.
That's right. It's winter for you.
Yeah. So we just had the equinox, but it was like shortest day of the year here and one of the coldest.
Yeah. And I'm the flip side. I'm in Western Colorado. So equinox of summer. A little bit different. But yeah, so my name is Joshua Sherman. I host the Tending Arms podcast. That is something I did about a season's worth a few years back and need to get back into. I also am one of the admins at the Divine Council Worldview page that's centered around the works of Dr. Michael Heiser, who originally got me interested in Leviticus in the first place, and then got connected with all of you at one point or another. And now I get to sometimes be involved in conversations like this where everyone else knows more than I do, and that's really fun.
All right. I am just, I have been so blessed by this group. Like, it's just been an absolute blast. And yeah, like Joshua Davidson over here, we're going to also give a shout out to Cosmic Corner because they talk about some really epic stuff. And we're going to cover, they're going to fit into a little bit of what we're talking about here too. So give a shout out to them because we like them a lot. All right. So Leviticus and Passover. What in the world are we doing with Passover in Leviticus? So we're going to talk about that today and what that means and why we need to care about that, because it might be important if it's in so many places in Torah. So, because God likes to repeat himself, especially when we're supposed to pay attention. So we're going to jump into. First, I want to start a couple of things to lay a little bit of groundwork. So if you're new to the series, we've been walking through Leviticus, and I always try to start with the narrative of where we are at in the journey and just kind of cover the basic, really quick narrative of the story here. And then I want to give you just a really quick little bit of some ancient Near East context before we jump into the whole meat of the thing. We'll do this as quickly as possible because I don't want to belabor the point. But we're starting with Leviticus and the narrative. So what do we have going on here? We've got Genesis. God creates this beautiful place and calls it good. Then he calls it holy because he is good, and then it's good. So he makes it like, this is holy. This is the great space that I have created to dwell with you. And then people mess it up. And then they mess it up, and then they mess it up, and they keep messing it up. And God keeps like, okay, tells Abraham, I'm going to bring a plan to fix it. Here comes Exodus. They start out in Egypt. God brings them out. And we get this whole plan, this beautiful tabernacle that is putting God in the middle of everything. And then they mess it up again. And we end Exodus with Moses not even be able to get back into the tabernacle, which is a problem because that's how they worship. And so what are we going to do? And we got Numbers coming after that with two of the worst road trips ever. And they keep messing it up again and again and keep breaking things again and again. And Deuteronomy is like, okay, guys, we have finally gotten you all the way here to the edge of the promised land. Don't mess this up. I'm going to keep my end of the covenant. Don't mess this up. But I know you're going to anyway. So here's how I'm going to fix it after you mess it up anyway. And right in the middle of that, we've got Leviticus. And it's this weird book. It's a whole bunch of crazy rules that we're like, what in the world is this? That hinges at the Day of Atonement, which we talked about last time a lot. But in there, sandwiched in a couple places, especially in Leviticus 23, and the festivals is Passover. So we're going to talk about Passover and the difference between the event and the festival and all of that good stuff here in a minute. But festivals, as a big part of the rhythm of the liturgy of worship of Israel, are really an important thing. And one of the things I loved looking into this and the festival stuff is how it's tied to the harvest and to the festival and to the feast and return to the harvest. Sorry, my brain is getting ahead of me here. Got a little either too much or not enough caffeine. I'm not sure which. So the Hebrew year starts with, there's this really cool thing you'll see in the Old Testament where you see barley and wheat mentioned together, always in that order. And it pops up all over the place, barley, wheat. And that's because barley and wheat mature at different rates. So barley matures first, then wheat matures. And it's this beautiful setup where starting in the north, it's kind of this ripple effect as the barley harvest trickles from the north to the south. So Israel can coordinate with each other in their tribes and in their local areas to keep each other's workers employed for longer, and it just kind of works its way down, and it gives this ripple effect of bounty for a whole month for the barley harvest. Then we start all over again with the wheat harvest, and it's the same thing. So you've got 2 months of bounty and provision that roll through Israel, and so it's really this beautiful thing that extends what would be a 1 week of work for your farmers into a whole 2 months of opportunity to glean and be blessed and provide for itself as a community. So that's the context that we're walking into as we start this discussion about Passover, then the festival of unleavened bread. So we're going to jump right in. So Courtney, will you kind of walk us through Passover, the event versus the feast day? Like what is going on there? Because there are 2 different Hebrew words even for those 2 things. Because one, the Passover event is one, and the feast day is another Hebrew word, but they are the same root, which is really cool. So, Courtney, Passover, take it away.
Yeah. So, I mean, and you guys feel free to add anything to this because I know, especially Phil, with all the research he's done for the book, I mean, he could school us all on this. But the difference is that when Passover first happens in the land of Egypt, the main difference that marks it off as separate from the feast day is the tabernacle itself. So there's this people try to conflate the two, but what is happening once you get the tabernacle and or temple with the sacrificial system is a commemoration of that first event and a participation in that first event. But the like lamb would have been, his blood would have been on the doorpost and all those kinds of things. This is not technically a sacrifice in that way because there is not a Levitical priesthood that is set up. There is not, a sacred space to offer this before God, right? It's not an attractional gift for God. So there's lots of things there in that original event in Egypt that, according to scholars like Andrew Rillera and others, but he really lays out the case in his book, that this kind of separates it as something different, that it's a historical event that's happening where God is saving his people, but it is not a sacrifice per se, because there are certain sacrificial markers or indicators that are not present there, namely like a priesthood and a concept of sacred space and these kinds of things. So that's why there's 2 separate things happening. Anything you guys will want to add to that, like as to why they're different? I mean, that was kind of a game changer for me when I realized that they were 2 separate things.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that stands out to me is that there is no memorial portion. So like every other sacrifice, every single one has a portion that is burned on the altar and is transfigured into smoke and arises to the mountain of the Lord and becomes a pleasing aroma. That is absent from the Passover ritual in Exodus 12 and 13. So that's one of the biggest things that stands out for me.
And I think, go ahead, Phil.
I kind of conceptualized it or wondered about whether it was like a reverse offering. So yeah, God doesn't get any, as opposed to all the other offerings where he either gets the whole lot or he gets a part. But in this one, while they're being oppressed in slavery, it's like God is saying, look, you're being oppressed. You're under a tyrannical ruler. You don't need to give any to me this time. This is my act of redemption. And we're going to get there, but it's like this time you enjoy the feast. It will become a memorial. But this time you eat it, and then we'll do it properly when we're at Sinai.
Right.
Right. And the blood serves a totally different function as well. The
Yes.
blood serves within the tabernacle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the blood serves like an apotropaic function, is like the technical function where it's
Mhm.
warding off danger
Mhm.
from the angel of death, right? And so it is not a cleansing function. So it's kind of
Mhm.
this warding off of an evil
Yeah.
influence or a bad influence, right? Instead of an attractional influence.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So
So when
that's
we
something
talked,
we've hit on
Amber,
a few times, but really directionality plays a really big important role in
Huge.
sacrificial logic. And if you are warding something off, like as in keeping it away versus attracting it, bringing it in, or you're sending something up or you're sending something down, like these are all really important in the understanding of sacrificial logic.
Mhm. I think it's also really interesting comparing the original Passover with then the Passover being celebrated as part of the cycle of the feasts. Because for the original Passover, it was, and then you're going to be delivered, right?
Mhm.
And when they then remember within the cycle of the feasts, they know more of the story, right? So there's a way in which the feast itself has more meaning to them than just we're going to be delivered, because they've seen that play out and they've seen subsequent things. They've seen the Sinai covenant. Like there's just a whole lot of kind of stuff that kind of plays into, and these are also ways in which God has provided for us as a way of following on and being faithful to the deliverance that he gave us. And that's just an interesting like dynamic that I've only started to kind of really kind of sift through in my head, of how sometimes these things can take on more meaning than the original meaning. And I think we see the same kind of thing with the Lord's Supper, and that, you know, they knew part of the story, but then as we remember ourselves and celebrate the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, communion, this is something that has more meaning to us in a way, because we know more of what God has done since the point where the disciples came together with Jesus and he broke the bread. So there's kind of an interesting kind of parallel there of, you know, how much meaning does this have packed into it, and the fact that the original and the subsequent memory of it, the subsequent participation in it, can actually have different meaning over time.
Yeah, and there's actually one other layer to consider too. One of the things that Moses keeps telling Pharaoh over and over as he goes to Pharaoh is, "Let my people go." And then what's the next part? So that they may go in the wilderness and
Mm-hmm.
worship me and offer sacrifices out there. So it it would be particularly unusual and odd to look at that and say, like Moses keeps saying, we can't offer sacrifices here. And then
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden at the end of it, now we can.
Mhm.
Now, granted, there is some nuance here. It's not necessarily like, is it a sacrifice? Yes or no, full stop, completely in every sense, yes or no. But in terms of functioning the way that sacrifices as we think of them
Mm-hmm.
function, it was not. It was not this act of communion with God. It was not this, hence the lack of the smoke rising. It was not this sense uh, of purification of sacred space, because the whole point is that Egypt is not sacred space. It is impure and space, and that's why they had to leave it to be able to create sacred space. You know, all that stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
one thing I found really, really fascinating when we talked last week, Amber,
Mhm.
you should check out that podcast, was the idea of reclaiming the space. And it's something that I hadn't really thought about in depth before, but it was a great chat. I loved it. But they're in the thick of it. Like they're in the
Mhm.
thick of like a demonic oppression. They're in the thick of enemy territory. And so it was purifying or reclaiming or making holy within enemy territory, within the midst of all the Egyptian gods and the demons that were there. But yeah, as a prelude to what they're looking forward to, which will happen at Sinai, which itself is a prelude to something else.
Right. Yes, that's a really important point. Yeah, it's warding off those. That's why I say it has that apotropaic function. It's warding off the evil spirits so that
Mhm.
they can flee. and be saved. And I think it's important to highlight the comment by Trey Brookley Amber where he says,
Yes,
Oh.
thank you.
"We shall say it's
Thank
the
you.
Passover
I was-
sacrifice to the Lord."
I was gonna ask that too, because Paul also says Christ our paschal lamb has been sacrificed. So there is, again, that's why I wanted to add the little nuance in there. There is a sense of a sacrificial element, but to say it is a sacrifice as we think of that term has to have a lot of careful explication. So I'd love to hear your response on that, Courtney.
Oh yeah, so just in that section of Exodus, like right prior to that are the instructions for how to do this first Passover, this historical Passover, to give it a designation, the historical Passover, where God, like the angel is going to go through and, separate the people and they're going to be saved. But in verse 24 is whenever the instructions for how to obey this as a lasting ordinance are given. So this is setting it apart as like, when you get into the land, this is what you're going to do. So at that point, it is proper to call it a sacrifice because we do have, again, the tabernacle, the ongoing perpetual fire, the priesthood, and it now has that purpose of cleansing sacred space instead of just warding off evil spirits, right? So cleansing sacred space is a different function altogether because this sacred space is God's space, so you wouldn't expect to encounter demons in God's space. So that's why it has a different function, and therefore sacrifice.
Yeah, and that's exactly why, because sacrifices are meals, and they're called offerings to God, and that's not something that we see happen because that's the quintessential function of the smoke rising is the offering to Yahweh, and so because that isn't present at the initial Passover event, that is not an offering to Yahweh.
I wonder, just thinking about that now, the smoke was almost, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, is almost visually connecting heaven and earth as the column of smoke ascends.
Yes.
And so I wonder whether that just would have been like, no, we're not connecting this space to heaven right now. That'll happen later.
Yeah.
Right.
This is not a good space to be in. I'm going to bring you out of this space. And so there's going to be no column of space. Oh, sorry, column of smoke.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's something that's really easy to miss in the Exodus narrative is how important the fire is, because that fire is associated with God's own presence. And so the like morning and evening Olah or whole ascension offering are to maintain the perpetual fire there. And so therefore to maintain God's presence in the space. And so even whenever they go off in exile, like one of their main concerns is how do we preserve this fire, even though the temple has been destroyed and we're in exile, and they try to bring the fire back at the end of exile to reconstitute the temple in Ezra and Nehemiah's temple. And so that fire represents God's presence himself. And so what Phil was saying is this column is connecting heaven and earth through the fire. And whenever you offer a sacrifice, the Lord's portion goes directly and touches the fire. And the people's portion, whether it's the portion that the priests eat or the people eat as well, is cooked in a pot. So it does not directly touch the fire because the fire is God's own divine presence in the midst of the people. So you're right. Like this is another reason why that sacrificial logic just really doesn't work in Exodus. Because like Phil was saying, like you're in the midst of enemy territory. You're in the territory of demons. And so we're going to get you out of here. And just like I love that point. Like, oh, this is not an adequate space for sacrifice. So we need to go into the desert to sacrifice. And so this, because of that, just isn't a sacrifice. Like it would be weird to say we need to go over there to do that, but then we can somehow do it here is kind of
It just hit me that going into the desert in many aspects thematically is not a good thing in scripture, right? So that's where the goat for Azazel is sent, right? That's where people kind of understood evil spirits to be. That it's considered a place that's outside of the camp, outside of the land. It's not safe, like all of these kinds of things. And yet in a way, like I feel like that tells you how bad Egypt was for them, because it's like we need to go to this place that normally is considered really bad, but it's actually better than where we are now, right? And I feel like you have a lot of these themes where you have, the idea of going down to Egypt, going down, connecting Egypt, and even ideas about death in the underworld that happen, that connect into some of the later ways that people start to talk about this when they then connect in the Passover into what Christ did to save us.
I have a thought and a question about that too, because most of the time wilderness is outside the camp. That is outside of Yahweh's protection. That is where the unclean things are sent. But we also see this minor thread pattern of that is where you go to meet Yahweh. That is where Christ goes in his 40 days. Elijah is sent out into the wilderness to meets God. Like, it is a place of danger, but it is also a place of meeting God. And there's I got Psalm 23 in my head. Like, you are walked through with Yahweh, so God is there too. So what a perfect place.
You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies, and
right,
the tabernacle in the wilderness.
What a perfect place, the imagery to take them from this dangerous place where they are, in enemy territory, out into another Wild West dangerous place to be birthed as set aside for Yahweh, because that's where Yahweh meets people, is in these wilderness wanderings, like John the Baptist. I mean, you see there's a pattern of this meeting God in these dangerous places. So that was another thought that I had.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the Psalm 23 reference that you made, Joshua, of yes, we prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies, is all about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. So like this kind of Egypt Sheol motif right there. And then what psalm comes next? Who shall ascend to the mountain of the Lord? And open up your lift up your heads, O you gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors. And so it is very much this connecting tissue of going through the tunnel of death, going through the channel, the realm of death and demons and all that stuff, and then coming out on the other side, and then being able to have the smoke that ascends.
It's really interesting thinking about the connectivity, perhaps, with Psalm 110 of Christ ruling in the midst of his enemies and providing a table for us in the midst of our enemies. And it's just like, oh, wow, like all of these things feel like they're so deeply connected in there.
Well, and that also makes me think about, because like Phil and I talked about last week, this word there with this Passover imagery that's happening with the blood on the doorways and things, when you pull in the Septuagint and how that's used in that Greek functioning there, it brings in this double picture, one of protection, and with the ancient Near East custom of putting blood on doors, and we talked about this too, it blocks bad spirits from coming in, but it also allows good spirits to come in and out. So God is creating this tunnel effect to take them out of Egypt into the wilderness in this so they're protected from the bad coming in, and their exit as those coming with Yahweh is also protected. So it's like a double covering in that ancient Near East imagery there, which is, I thought, really, really interesting.
Yeah, especially if you connect it to the passing through the waters. Like what kind of protection do you have where it's like, now we're going through this, and that being emblematic of passing through death. And like, there's, again, so many layers to that in meaning.
It's a new creation as well. Yeah, like Yahweh is bringing them out of that space into the wilderness so that he can make a new creation and create a people from a people who weren't a people.
Right.
Else
so
okay,
go ahead.
Just kind of, it's not off topic, but it's something I noticed when reading the Joseph story, is that Joseph actually creates an Eden-like environment in Egypt. So Egypt becomes the place of blessing that blesses the surrounding nations. And Egypt is the place where Yahweh's blessing comes from. And Israel, Joseph's brothers, come into Egypt and they are blessed in there. But then Egypt kind of goes bad. So it's almost like God can make any space his space, and a space of blessing and a garden space. But in this act, he's creating a new people, and he's doing a new act and a new creation act.
Which that might be a great place to transition into talking about ransom and redemption.
Yeah, I was
Well,
gonna
I
say,
want
how
to.
was Joseph brought to Egypt?
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
exactly.
I want to hit the Feast of Unleavened Bread really quickly
Oh,
before
right.
we do
Yes,
that. I
yes.
don't want to lose the thread and the thought there, because we know that's important, because we need this to get to the end. So,
Mhm.
one of the
Yeah.
things, and one of the things I really thought fascinating when I was looking at this, because you've got the single event of Passover, and they've got the meal, they've got the destroyer coming through, you've got Yahweh guarding his people while death goes and wreaks havoc on everyone else as the agent of judgment. And then, but when we get to the establishing of these feasts and reiterating these in Leviticus, those events are separated. So you've got Passover, which it symbolizes the event of being saved out, but then you've got unleavened bread, and that is a remembrance of the meal itself, of sitting down and eating that together. And meals in the ancient Near East were such a huge thing. So it's like, Passover's one day, and then the next day the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts, and it goes for a week. And so it's like a week. We're going to remember for a day being saved and redeemed out of Egypt, but for a whole week we're going to sit and eat and remember it. So I really like that imagery of that play of separating those two out, and just really sitting in that idea that those we have the moment, I don't know, somebody else can, like, my brain is kind of stuck in us in thinking about that for a second. So this the beauty of the meal being the thing that is the time we sit and savor and spend more time on than the remembering of the event itself. It is the participation in community together, eating in that, in the benefits of that event, I guess, is kind of what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, I think there's something to the recognition that that cycle of feasts and festivals,
Mhm.
it isn't just here's a moment and now we move on, but there is a sense of really dwelling in those
Mhm.
places and dwelling in the remembrance, dwelling in the deliverance that God has accomplished, and that, I think, participating in that helps to settle people more than just I remember in my head, right? But it's we're going to do this
Yeah.
together. We're going to, so that's where I think there is so much that's just important about having that cycle of time that's defined
Mhm.
as sacred time. And
Yeah.
obviously there are different ways people approach that, but it's very important.
Because in that liturgical remembrance, there is a representing. The
Mhm.
event is brought forward from the past into the present. And that's one of the reasons why they say, like, why are we doing this? Well, we are doing this because we were rescued out of Egypt. Like, that's
Mhm.
not just like a fancy, solidarity across the generations kind of way of talking. There's a sense of saying, no, we were there. We were with those people. Just like when Moses is on um, speaking to the next generation in Deuteronomy, he says, this covenant was made with you. And it's like, no,
Mhm.
we were all dead, or not dead.
We
We
weren't born
weren't
yet.
born yet. We weren't born
Mhm.
yet. What are you talking about? Well, yes, because that's exactly how Hebrew liturgical ritual thought
Mhm.
went, that when you participate in it, you are representing the past
Mhm.
event.
Right. That's exactly how this like old, like, Torah period of the Old Testament, because I think sometimes we overgeneralize, like, the Hebrew mind throughout the entire Old Testament is the same thing, but it's very different. The Torah experience is going to be very different than the King David experience, and the way that they think, and Hebrew is different, so that there's an evolution there. So backing up to the Torah mindset, their experience of time, this is largely agrarian, semi-nomadic, nomadic, and their experience of life is cyclical. And so they experience, like, are thinking about time like we experience the seasons the same, but there's markers to where they're different as well. So we're living the same moment over and over again, but there's things that distinguish those, because you hear things like the story of flood narratives, and they'll point out things and markers in history of something that we would look at more as like a linear progression of time, but they don't always necessarily experience that way, because fall and spring and summer and winter are basically the same thing, but sometimes there's differences and things that point out and make those certain ones distinguishable from others. And so that's kind of the way that fits in with the liturgical idea of experiencing the same thing over and over and over again, because that's the way they would have experienced life.
Yeah, I do think it's important to say that this kind of is just ritual logic. Like, it's
Mhm.
not even just like in the Torah. Like, if you look at scholars like Mircea Eliade or others that are looking at people who participate in cyclical rituals across cultures, even up until this day, like Mircea Eliade was looking at Aboriginal cultures. So, I mean, like, these are like in our modern period, but what is their logic around why they're participating in rituals, and does that kind of track across multiple religions? And that is how most religions think of participating in a ritual, is that you
Mhm.
are sacred time is of an inestimable duration. Like, it can always be re-entered into and represented in the present moment. It does not pass, is what Mircea Eliade says. It does not pass. So you can always re-enter into it. And so, like what Spencer was saying, like in Deuteronomy chapter 6 in the Shema, when they say, like, when your children come to you and say, why are we doing all of these things, they say, because God brought us up out of Egypt. And there's a very real way in which, as someone who participated in that lineage, that you would not be where you were today if God had not brought your ancestors up. So in bringing your ancestors up, God also brought you up, and you're participating in that again. And you go through these different sacred rituals so that you can remember the different moments of time in which God has done something for you and for your people, right? And so you're reenacting your sacred calendar or your sacred moments with your God throughout the liturgical year. And so that's just like, that's ritual logic. Like, that's just like kind of across time and cultures, that's what they're doing. So if you were like, my family's from Brazil, and in the particular area that they're from, Brazil, there are indigenous tribes there, and they put on masks, and in putting on the masks, they are becoming the deity and reenacting the story. Representing is a great way to say it, because we think of reenactment meaning it's not real. There's not a real participation. It's like I'm faking it, but they are reenacting it, meaning they are doing it again. They are acting through it again. And so that's how they would conceive of it as well.
Which I think adds to thinking more about why those two things, those festivals are separated. You've got Passover, that's a day, and a week of Feast of Unleavened Bread that is sitting, eating communally together, re-experiencing and communally remembering this event and re-experiencing this sacred time. And that takes time, because God is a God of slow. Because it is about experience. You can't fast your way, not eat fast, but speed your way into relationship. It has to be done slowly. It has to be nurtured. It has to be embodied. It has to be done together. And that takes slowness and time in the way that we experience it. So I just love that we have this marker of, get ready. We're getting ready to experience this. Here's what happened. Now we're going to sit and remember it together.
And the
God
recreation
says-
motif is really important. I don't know, Sherman, were you going to talk?
I think I was.
Go ahead. You go.
Just
I don't
really,
want
really
to-
quickly. Do we sound similar? The chat is
I
amazing.
thought Sherman
I
went like
unmuted
this.
at the same time.
I
so
saw
she was-
Sherman do this. So
that God creates, he says it's a new year, the beginning of a new year for you.
Mm-hmm.
So where previously it would have been the head of the household who was acting as the priest, which was kind of normal for like Abraham and Noah figures. They offered sacrifice to Yahweh, and they were acting in that priestly role on behalf of their families as the patriarchal figure of their family. But I think what God is doing is he's creating a people and saying, okay, now this is going to be the beginnings of this sacred time that we're talking about, and it's going to be the beginnings of a new year for you. So it's a new year, it's a new people, it's new time, it's new space, it's new everything, new creation.
I think it's
and new
interesting.
priesthood as well, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like we all live in the midst of our own story, just automatically. It's how we experience life, right? Oh, I'm doing this now. I'm doing this, and these kinds of rhythms help us to remember the larger story that we're actually part of. And sometimes it's that the kind of thing of like, oh, I see you've forgotten. Let me remind you again. you know, and we can see this in the cycle of feasts and festivals in the Hebrew Scriptures. We see this in the way that we remember things in Christian practice, where it's like, okay, so every Sunday we're gathering, we're remembering, we're celebrating the resurrection. Like there's this constant reminder for us because we're very forgetful. It's very easy for us to get pulled into the finite things of life and forget the larger story that we're part of.
Right.
And
And
like
speaking of
Josh-
being forgetful, go ahead.
So just really quickly, what you're saying is, and like one of the Joshes said, that the memorial is it's a noun. It's a memorial thing. It's a memorial meal or a memorial day or a memorial feast. It's not just like we have to conjure up this kind of ethereal memory. It's a thing that you participate in.
And it's sacrificial language. Like it's tied into the whole system of Israel's sacrifices, the memorial stuff. So you can't separate the two completely.
Yeah. Whenever we think of memory, we do, like Phil was mentioning, think of recollection or something that like you're bringing from the past and trying hard to bring it from the past. But like remembering is something that God does. So like God doesn't forget,
Yeah.
And so then therefore really God's act of remembering then determines what remembering is like for the people.
Yeah.
So when God, like in Exodus chapter 2, the cries of the people go up to God and of their suffering, and God says, I am going to remember the promises I made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and bring you up out of this place. Did he forget the promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What were those promises? The promises were that you're going to be there for 400 years and then I'm going to bring you up, right? No, he didn't forget, but now is the time to make that promise come to fruition. So in remembering, you are doing something now. And so if you're doing like a memorial for a funeral, if you forget your ancestors, it's because you're no longer living in the way of your ancestors. You're no longer enacting their life. So that is forgetting your ancestors. And so remembering your ancestors would be living according to the way that they taught you. Right. So it's a very active verb.
That sounds a lot like being children of Abraham. John.
What were you going to ask, Phil?
I just then, as Courtney was talking, the cries of the Israelites go up. I wonder if that's the same. The cries of the Israelites go up like the smoke, and God remembers, or God pays attention to what's happening, and then God comes down.
Yeah, it does use that language at the beginning of Exodus. It says God remembered his covenant, which of course is not like I forgot. It's like he brought it to mind. He brought it to the front of his mind, almost like like there's all these different data points, and the data point that we focus on is the one that becomes what we call super salient. It's the one that really matters and becomes almost like the filter through which everything else is seen. And so it's kind of that sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk of God remembering throughout, especially the Old Testament, but which brings us back to what is it we're remembering, and this connection in the Passover event, their release from Egypt, and it is this connection to a release from slavery. It's a release from bondage, which we're going to see reverberate all throughout the rest of the Bible, this idea of being taken out of bondage and being brought into a new thing, being set aside with Yahweh as a new thing. So we start with, and so first I want to just remind everybody, we are not talking about American chattel slavery here. We are talking about the ancient Near East context of slavery, which is a very different thing. But there is in the whole of the Old Testament, there is, and even I think in the New Testament, there is this idea of ownership. So you are owned by your deity. You are owned by your king. You are owned by your sovereign. You are owned by whoever is at a station above you. You are owned in a sense by them, but not in the sense that we got to step out of American chattel slavery. That's not what we're talking about here. this is an idea where there is, I don't know, it's a little hard to explain. I don't think we have time to get into that too much. There's lots of other people have content on that, but but what is happening here as they're being brought out of Egypt, the language is a transfer of ownership. You were owned by the deities of Egypt. You were owned by Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and now you are owned by Yahweh. He is your deity. He is your king. He is your sovereign. You are owned by Yahweh. And that is the pulling out, and that is the separating them out. But he brings them so far out. I own you. And part of the setting aside of the priesthood that we see is God's portion of this thing that he is now in possession of. And it's just this beautiful idea. And Paul brings this in when he talks about that we have been bought with a price. This is what Paul's talking about, this bringing out of Egypt. You are bought by Yahweh because he is redeeming all of creation and all of humanity, buying them back. And this is the first step and the first image in that buying back of creation and humanity. And Paul just it's kind of synthesizes that whole thing for us. But we're remembering that we are owned by Yahweh. He is our sovereign and our king and our deity. So does anybody have any other connections there they want to pull into that one?
I mean, I feel like that connects really naturally into gospel, recognizing that, like when we proclaim the gospel, what are we proclaiming? We're proclaiming the victory of God, and we're proclaiming the reign of God. And, in particular in kind of New Testament, like we're proclaiming the victory and the reign of Jesus Christ over sin, death, and demons. And what does that look like? Part of that is what Paul refers to as the obedience of faith. Right? And so a sense of living into the life that God has created us for, instead of living into the life that, maybe our passions or other deities or demons are kind of trying to steer us toward. Right. So there is a sense of surrender of the things that you might want that are not in concurrence with what Yahweh has called people to. And then living a life of obedience to what he has called us to. And that plays into, I think, this idea of, what it means when Paul talks about us actually being, slaves of God, right? It's in that context. It's that we are set free in order to be obedient to God, and in being obedient to God, that also then sets us free to be even more freely who we were created to be. And that freedom is not just about being able to do whatever you want, but it's being able to live as we were made to be, and not being hindered by all of these things that pull us back. And that's a lot of the way that Maximus the Confessor looks at freedom of the will is around that idea.
Right, which kind of, that takes us right into ransom and redemption, because there's a lot of language going on here with ransom and redemption. So I was wondering if we could start with Courtney, if you can kind of go into the Hebrew behind like ransom redemption idea, like what's going on linguistically there with that.
Like with the Hebrew verb ga'al, that one?
Yeah.
So it's really important to like tie together these themes of creation and redemption that we've been talking about, and especially like sacred space. So as we've talked about this, we're going from the realm of darkness and these other deities, and we're being brought up and through death into this new creation space. And like Phil was saying, God really can make Eden wherever he is, because he is the living God, and it's his presence that defined really the boundaries of Eden in the first place. But therefore, whenever we go through these different festal cycles, they usually happen on 7s and 1s, right? So you have like 7 days, and then the 8th day is like this new day of creation, which what you see in Genesis chapter 1 is like you have the 7-day creation story, and the 8th day is really the day that like we're all living into, because God created the 7th day, and there is no other like mention of, and it was evening and morning the 7th day, right? Like, so you're kind of living in this 8-day period. So as you go through like Exodus and Leviticus, you still have these 8-day cycles that are happening. And that's why you have Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. And that 8th day is the new creation. So when Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, they're driven into the wilderness, right? and out of the garden. So God is driving his people out of slavery in Egypt so that he can reclaim them as his own in his own new garden, which is going to be the promised land. And so you have this 7-day cycle of unleavened bread that's celebrating that. And then the 8th day is the festival of first fruits, because it's the day in which, you know, in the ritual logic, you enter the land and you reap the fruit of the land of Eden again, right? So you're able to go back into the tree of life, basically, and reclaim immortality in that way. And so so you see kind of Cain and Abel trying to figure out what is that sacrificial logic now that they're outside of Eden, because they're in the desert land, and Cain brings God like some of the first fruits of the ground, and then obviously Abel brings God the flock of his sheep. And so it's kind of interesting that those are the things that are also put on the altar, with grain and fruit of wine, and then sheep, right? Those are the things that make up the olah offering, or the tamid, the daily offering. So all that is to say is that in the ancient Near East, deities performed specific functions, and they were associated with specific functions and geographical territories. This is kind of Michael Heiser language, but it is not at all obvious to anyone who's paying attention to what's happening in the spiritual world that the God of creation could be the God of salvation, and could be the God who would take you into another territory and rule over you there. Usually you moving to another territory meant that you worshiped another God, right? And so what God is doing in the Passover, the historical Passover, is saying, I have claim over this territory in Egypt because I can protect you even here in Egypt. And he's kind of bringing them out of that darkness of creation, and making them into a new people again by bringing them through the wilderness, just like in creation, where you have to separate the land, and then there's a dry land, and then there's no fruit. There's nothing for the to like be yielded, and then eventually there's these trees of fruit, right? So that's what God is doing. He's recreating things. So again, it's not at all intuitive that the God who created everything could be the God that could save you in a foreign land, that, like, you know, the land of Canaan is not the land of Egypt, and vice versa. But then also, it's not, because of that, redemption is not always connected to the God of creation. So that's something that's very important that's happening here, that God is doing. He's saying, I'm the God who created all things. Right? In naming himself in Exodus chapter 3 with a tetragrammaton, he is claiming that he's the God who made all things, because it comes from the Hebrew root to be. So he's the one who brought everything into being, who created all things. But then what we see in Exodus chapter 15, as they celebrate God's salvation, is that they call him the God of redemption, or the Goel. Or they use the Hebrew verb Gaal for the first time to refer to this deity, right? So they had the name of creation, and they're just now calling him the God of redemption or salvation. And Gaal, the Hebrew verb Gaal, or the verb is Gaal, to redeem. The noun Goel is like redeemer, is a covenant term, which can be used in different types of covenantal relationships, so work relationships with slaves and their masters, or marriage relationships, land covenants, all those kinds of things. Obviously, you're like, oh, God's kind of all of that with his people. He's the bridegroom, they're his bride. He is the one who gives them land as an inheritance, so he's got this land treaty with them, and he's also the one in whom they're going to serve or work or worship. It's all the same verb. Like in terms of translation, it's avad, the Hebrew verb avad. And so far, they have been serving Pharaoh. And so he's going to transfer their work to his work, which is why in the 10 Commandments, you get these commands about, for 6 days you shall work. He's giving them the terms of their labor. And it's going to be laboring unto the Lord. And on the 7th day, you don't work, right? That's the Sabbath. Because each 7-day cycle kind of represents a new creation moment, because they're remembering new creation, and now they're also commemorating salvation as well. In the Passover. So this is kind of a unique moment. Like I said, that the God of creation is also linked with salvation or redemption, and Gaal is this, in this case, related to kind of freedom or release from slavery. And there's a couple of different ways, I'm probably going on way too long, that you can be released from slavery, from a record of debt or a record of slavery. And that is, it is paid off in some form or fashion, or it is canceled, and you are released from it. And there, the main way that it gets canceled is you have a sovereign king, or someone who ranks higher than the one whom you are indebted to, who says that this record of debt is no longer valid. right?
Mm-hmm.
So like if I were to be working for, a farmer and he's got a lot of land, and the king of the land says you can no longer own slaves, and the king of the land cancels the record of debt for everybody who is underneath that farmer. So that's what's happening with Pharaoh. He's a subsidiary in God's kingdom. And so God can just say, you no longer have
Yeah.
dominion over
Yeah.
my people
Yeah.
because I rank higher than you.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It's almost like he's stepping in and saying, these were my people, and I handed them over to you, or you took possession of them, whatever, however you want to frame that.
Mhm.
And you were authorized only a certain brief. You were
Right.
only authorized to treat them a certain way, but you, just like he talks to, says the same thing to the Babylonians in Isaiah 47, when he says, like, on the poor and the aged and the old, or sorry, the aged and the infirm, you made the yoke really, really heavy. So
Mhm.
the whole point there is to say, like, yes, you were acting as my agent, but you were going way off of what I told you to do, and so therefore all the debts that they have to you are wiped out, because I am the one who ultimately is in charge of the entire moral economic system there. So I'm going to
Mhm.
get rid of it. I'm not going to demand payment on that, because that was unjust payment, or unjust debt, basically.
Right.
And,
And yeah,
and
and you
we,
see the same thing with like Babylon and Assyria in the exile as well. They're his
Yes.
agent, his cosmic agent of justice to cleanse the land so that the land can be cleansed and remove the Israelites and or the Judaites out of there. But then once they've overstepped their boundaries, and the judgment will come back on them.
Mhm.
Yeah. Go
Which
ahead.
is,
Sorry.
I mean, that's where you see, God saying, I am going to ransom you from the gods, I'm going to judge the gods of Egypt, and I'm going to ransom you with my mighty right hand. Right?
Mhm.
It's not like I'm going to issue a payment to Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt in order to free you. The payment
Right.
is basically a butt kicking. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
it's a whole different way of doing that. And this is one of those things where, you start to ask questions about, well, was the price paid to free each individual Israelite? And it's like, well, no, that wasn't the logic, right? It was God freed the whole people, and the people partook of that by doing what God said, by partaking of the Passover and by leaving Egypt. And even people that were not originally of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob left with them and became part of the people that left and got kind of folded into the ritual life of the people of God. And I mean, you even have people that, they're not of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are heading up tribes later on in scripture. And you kind of go like, this is a little bit more complex than I remember thinking about it when I studied things, or when I heard things in Sunday school, where, you have the people that set aside, but then you also have a way of God kind of inviting other people into it.
and I kind of want to like turn a little bit, pivot a little bit, but kind of staying in this with this theme of redemption and atonement, and kind of how this works, and thinking about this, because this is a repeat pattern. You see this established here in Exodus. They're supposed to remember this, and that's set up with the festivals and reinforced in Leviticus. But then the same thing, like we relive Passover as an event again with Deuteronomy. They're warned. They're thrown out, and Yahweh meets Ezekiel in Babylon, and you're like, you read that, Ezekiel 1. A lot of that language there is the description of what you would expect for Enlil. You would expect to see the deity of Babylon being described there, and all, and then at the end, nope, it's Yahweh. And it's like a repeat of Exodus, and he's meeting them there. Why is Yahweh in Babylon? That's Enlil's territory. That's Marduk's territory. That's not Yahweh's territory. Yes, it is. God is, again, like he did in Egypt, reclaiming that. And then we're going to see that get even bigger with in the New Testament, and with Christ's work on the cross and resurrection, the cosmic reclaiming of Yahweh to say, all of it is mine. Ultimately, finally, end of discussion. It all belongs to me. And I just love, but I'm wondering, as we're kind of thinking through this idea, and as I've been like rolling this around in my head for a couple of days, trying to get it to come out with something that's articulatable. So I just want to kind of throw this out there. But I'm wondering, because you start with the experience of Passover, and it's Israel, and they're going through with their, establishing their spaces. They go through this ritual. They're brought out into the desert, and Yahweh's like, okay, look, I brought you out. I'm faithful to bring you out. And in establishing, as we're doing in Exodus, establishing the pulling out of Israel, and offers them the covenant. It seems to me like they say, yeah, we'll do it. But the pattern is that they never fully submit to to Yahweh. And so their hard hearts are never fully softened so that they can actually live in that covenant relationship. And how that struggle of submission, in a way that if you're coming out of a slavery context where you have experienced generations of bondage, and that Yahweh offers you another experience that says, submit to me, how much does that remembrance of maybe it's not bondage, but it's a freedom in a way that we don't understand? Like, Josh, I really want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where some of this can come down to even just the way that we experience that within the churches we've been in. And so, a lot of people, the way that they experience authority and submission really kind of ends up being this very authority and submission angled kind of thing. And so, but the way that I generally, have experienced that being part of the Eastern Orthodox Church is it's more a sense of the authority that your priest has over you is as a pastor, right? Is as someone that is shepherding you, right? And not just pastor, like, Pastor Tom, Pastor Jeff, Pastor whoever, but like, no, really, like, this word means to shepherd. And there's a lot of care that goes into that. And yes, there's authority that is involved in that, but it's much more about leading somebody in life in a way that's healthy and helping them to heal from the wounds of sin and death and these things that have been part of their life. And it's just very different. So I think that's a lot of it's a reflection in a lot of ways for me of like a different layer of experiencing what it would have been like for Israel to actually live into submission to Yahweh and into the law, into what God had commanded them, versus what they a lot of times did, which was, no, but we want to do it our own way. And you see God kind of calling them back again and again and being like, no, like, once again, just in case we didn't get this straight, right? There's life and there's death. Choose life. That's what you want. I'm going to give you a hint.
Yep.
Choose life.
That you may live. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody have any other thoughts on that? Because it's been like kicking around in my brain a lot for the last couple of days, especially.
I almost wonder if there is, and this is a thought that quite literally just popped into my head. So this might be totally wacky, but I almost wonder if there's not an element of like redeeming that sense of submission and authority whole cloth in the Israelite experience, because like that refrain comes up an awful lot. Do this because you were slaves in Egypt. You know what it feels like. And if there's one thing that we know from experience, as well as like from like if anyone's ever read Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf, it's really, really good on this. And it talks about how and I wish I could recall the exact quote off the top of my head, but I can't. But it's essentially that the liberator, the one problem with the liberators is that they never take off their uniforms. Their military uniforms. And so it becomes this invariable problem of the oppressed always become oppressors, or and then they just turn it becomes inverted injustice, as soon as the scales are flipped. And so I almost wonder if like there's an element of that may have been part of why God worked with them and allowed slavery in their context, to be able to say, look, but allowed it in very, very carefully prescribed ways, and totally distinct from and totally different from all the nations surrounding them. The whole point, I wonder if the point there wasn't just to say, okay, you were oppressed harshly, mightily, very awfully. I do not want you to go out and oppress people back in return. I know the human heart. I know how this works. So I'm going to teach you what real authority looks like, so that you can feel what real submission looks like. And I want to redeem that experience for you, instead of you running in fear the opposite direction. So
That's really interesting.
Little bit of Spencer Midrash there. No
Well,
idea how
it's
accurate
it's
it is.
interesting too, just thinking about the contrast in the idea of submission, right? When submission is literally the meaning of Islam, right? And going, okay, like, what is the contrast when you have submission, the way that we see that play out in Islam versus the way that we see it play out in Christianity, the way it's supposed to play out, right? Where the submission is to Jesus, who is God incarnate, who is, our King, and who suffered for us. Like, there's an element of the understanding and Jesus needing to become like us in order to be a high priest for us. That kind of submission is just very different from the impression that I get looking at the way that submission is understood in Islam and practiced that way. And I think the incarnation is a huge part of that. And I think the nature of Jesus, self-giving love, and the nature of his priesthood are huge parts of that too.
But I also wonder if this doesn't go back to Ezekiel 37, and that tying that to Romans 5, where we die to the carnal and are reborn in the spirit, and that is the release of the bondage that becomes the freedom of submission. And that's part of how that transition works there.
Yes.
Well, it's very two observations. One is, it matters immensely who you're submitting to. It's not just submission qua submission. It's to whom are you submitting? So for example, like my daughter, she should submit to me. Now, of course, I, hopefully, as a loving father, will do that in a particular way that's not going to be abusive and controlling and all those other kind of things. But that that does make a really big difference in terms of how we experience submission. And I seem to have lost the other thought, so I'll just leave it there.
All right. So are we trying to get us back? And I'm looking at this, so because my brain is going so many different ways here.
There's so many interconnections
Rabbi-
that it makes it really fun for rabbit
Right.
trails, and then you realize, okay, where am I?
Where am I at? So transitioning back into looking at the elements of sacrifice and the roles of the mechanics of the pieces that are involved here. So you've got like the elements of sacrifice. So Spencer and Phil, can you guys just talk some about the elements of sacrifice and the pieces that we see involved with the Feast of Passover? So we're moving off of the event of Passover and moving more into the Leviticus part of this now with all of the things that are described, especially in Leviticus 23, is where we start talking about the festivals and feasts. Or did I stump everybody with that question?
I guess it might be important to make the point that a sacrifice isn't a ransom payment. I think that's important. But quickly, before we move into sacrifice, maybe thinking about ransom, the Greek word redeem or ransom involves the idea of the means by which something is rescued. Can we just quickly clarify the difference between the Greek idea and the Hebrew idea? And then we can maybe talk about how a sacrifice helps with that idea.
Yeah, I think the Hebrew idea can refer to the means as well, but because the Hebrew triradical root system is Like the verb is so connected to any noun form of something. So like you can't really separate like the verb to redeem from the means by which you are redeemed, right? So there are multiple means by which you're redeemed, and one of those is payment of a debt. And if we're talking about in a slavery context, payment of the debt, or a release from slavery, like a canceling of the record of debt. And so, like in Colossians, if we're talking about the Greek term in Colossians, like that's what we see Christ doing, where it says that he canceled the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. So we had legal demands on us because we were slaves to unrighteousness, or slaves to the rulers and authorities, as it says here in Colossians chapter 2. We were slaves to those rulers and authorities. But Christ canceled the record of debt by triumphing over them, is what Colossians says. So by securing a victory that would kind of dethrone them from their power and rule and authority over us. So that's kind of, I think, the way that in Greek, at least, Christ maps onto the Passover sacrifice. But even where what you see in Exodus 15, which is where like these verbs to redeem and purchase are first used, it's God has redeemed his people, and he has purchased his people in Exodus 15:16 by bringing terror upon the nations, which is by securing the victory. So that's how he redeems them in Exodus 15 as well.
So when Jesus came and Jesus says to give his life as a ransom for many, that conversation could be like a 4-hour conversation.
Good, for sure.
But it could, if we're thinking about the means by which he redeemed, or the means by which he rescued his people, it could be anything. It could be like a sword, it could be a sledgehammer to break down the walls, it could be a helicopter to bring them out of a concentration
Right.
camp or something.
He could have showed up with a truckload of gold and paid the devil off. And like I said, Colossians chapter 2 says that he does that through his death. And so if you're thinking about the harrowing of Hades, he harrows Hades through his death and triumphs over the rulers and authorities. So he conquers death, which is the means by which he achieves that ransom, at least in Colossians chapter 2. There might be other places like in Hebrews where you get a different means in some way. Does that clarify that question, Phil? I don't know.
Yes, I think that's super helpful. And so what we're not saying is that a sacrifice is a payment.
Right.
And I think that's what we hear a lot, is the conflation of sacrifice and redemption in that way, whereas someone needed to be paid and the sacrifice is what the payment was. And then that gets a little bit muddy, like what was it? Because they don't really think it was the gift of the offering on the altar, but the death had to pay for something, which is a weird way of paying someone.
Yeah.
Showing up with the Happy Meal saying, does this let the people off?
Yeah. Hebrews 2 is a place where you see that, right? That Jesus conquers death by death, and takes the power of death from the devil, right? And so you very much have a sense of that kind of conquering approach to how this works, and at least in Hebrews 2. And I think that's a big part of where the idea of the harrowing of Hades comes in. I think it's partly why you'll see things like, I see on the prosophoria, the bread that we use for communion in the Orthodox Church, it has stamped on it, Jesus Christ conquers. It's like, it's very clear that it's like upfront, like this is what we are partaking of, as the victory of God in Christ over death and over sin and over demons. Like that's a big part of the understanding of it, and looking at kind of the parallels and saying, God is going to judge the gods of Egypt and bring his people out. Well, now, in the new Passover, in the cosmic Passover, who is God judging and who is coming out? Like there's a very similar sense of deliverance through victory that is part of what's going on here. So I won't say it's all of the meaning, but there's definitely that motif, very clearly thrust into the middle of it. And it's thrust in the middle of how Christians kind of historically have kind of understood this. So I could read a whole bunch from on Pascha to kind of illustrate that. But you very much have a sense where Melito talks about the fact that humanity comes under the dominion of death through the sin of Adam and Eve. And he says, let's see. All flesh fell under sin, and every body under death, and every soul was plucked from its dwelling place of flesh, and that which was taken from the dust was reduced to dust, and the gift of God was locked away in Hades. What was marvelously knit together was unraveled, and the beautiful body divided. Humanity was doled out by death, for a strange disaster and captivity surrounded him. He was dragged off a captive under the shadow of death, and the Father's image was left desolate. For this reason is the Paschal mystery completed in the body of the Lord, right? In Christ entering into that captivity and bringing people out. And the end of this book is awesome. I mean, he just, again, it's like, basically like Jesus saying like, this is who I am. How dare you defy me? That I am the one who's again, like, kind of like in Revelation 1:18, I'm the Alpha and Omega. I am the one who died and is now alive. I'm the living one. I hold the keys of death and Hades. I'm the one that has the power of this now. And that sense, again, of victory, that sense of Passover, there's very much the deliverance of bringing people out. I think a lot of times what happens is that when people hear the Passover and they think payment, they just think the cross, and they kind of stop there. And then that's the extent to which they understand the connections in the New Testament and the Old, where there's just a whole lot more going on.
Yeah, they think like Passover, sheep, payment, cross. And
Yes.
Jesus is the Passover lamb. So he's a sheep paying.
Equals freedom, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm watching Seinfeld. Yada yada yada.
But like I feel like Phil, just to answer your question more thoroughly, like for the sake of the audience, because there are like really pivotal passages to understand. So like what you're saying is a really good clarification. Redemption is an economic metaphor, not a sacrificial metaphor. So we can't like conflate them, because sacrifice and tabernacle temple are two separate things from the economic reality of like a covenant or labor or anything like that. And so Exodus 15, really you should kind of always start when you're looking at any given word. What is the original like theological context that word is brought up in? It might not be the first context that word is brought up in, period, but the first real theological context that the word ga'al, or to redeem, is brought up in is in Exodus chapter 15, as again it relates to Yahweh. And so it says, who is like you among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome and glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You've led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. Right? So these are the people. And how did he redeem them? By his right hand, doing these glorious deeds, saving them from Egypt. Terror and dread fell upon the nations because of the greatness of your arm. Till your people, O Lord, pass by, the people pass by whom you have purchased. So that is the economic metaphor as it relates to what God has done. He redeemed them by bringing them through the waters and crushing their enemies, right, in this kind of cosmic battle. And so then you go and look at where is this word used in similar context with all the same motifs being brought up. And Isaiah 52, right before the suffering servant, and Isaiah 53 is really important for that, because it's a recapitulation of the Exodus, because the people are now in exile. So they're back under the domain of the nations, and they need to be brought out of exile. So it's going to be a new Exodus motif. And so it says, for thus says the Lord, you were sold for nothing and you shall be redeemed without money. Right. Yeah. So without any payment, you were sold for nothing. So they went into Egypt willfully. They became slaves in Egypt willfully, basically. Like, I mean, obviously they went there under Joseph for protection, but they became slaves. So they were sold without money. So they were redeemed without money. God didn't pay anyone to get them up out of Egypt. And the same thing, they went into exile. They weren't sold into exile. They went into exile willfully through their own rebellion. And so they're going to be redeemed without money. And the same means by which they were saved in the Exodus is going to happen again through exile. And Jesus is that new exile motif, right? So that section, Isaiah 52, says, the Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. So it's still with the right arm of God, or the power of God, that at least Exodus and Isaiah 52 both mention is going to be the salvation of his people from among the nations. So that would be the means of redemption, is the power of God. Without money, without transaction. There is no transaction.
Yeah. Well, and I put it in the chat earlier, but I would also highlight Isaiah 43:3 when he's talking about the exodus from Egypt, and he tells the people of Israel, I give Egypt as your ransom. So so the idea there is like it's almost like God is the one giving the ransom, but again, like to whom? Because there's no other third party here outside of Israel and
Mhm.
slash God and Egypt slash the gods of Egypt. And so it's very much the sense of just at a basic level, the cost it takes, the
Mhm.
cost that it takes to actually affect the redemption, the release from slavery. And so I think it's really important there because we can look at that and say, okay, God was stomping on the Egyptians, but let's not forget that there's a whole narrative there about firstborn children dying. Like this is really,
Mhm.
really, really heavy and serious.
Mhm.
And so I think it's really important to highlight that passage in Isaiah 43 because God's not saying, ha ha ha, look what I did to the Egyptians. He's saying, look, I had to give up something costly to get you out of there. I loved those children too. I love the Egyptians too. And they are also mine in a different way that you are mine, but they are also mine. And so that's that sense of really high price that God gives up to be able to make Israel his chosen people.
So what is absent in that narrative is, again, the Passover lamb as that price.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
So the Passover is a way, it's not a payment, but it's a way to participate in God's redeeming act.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm.
All right. So are we ready to have we wrestled through this one and ready to get into the elements of sacrifice, or are we want to hit one more visual to kind of wrap that together?
That was a good segue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
And Spencer, hey, you have a hard stop fairly soon, don't you?
20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's
But you guys can keep going and I'll just pop off. So it's fine.
Yeah.
So elements of self. Before Spencer goes, I really want he and Phil to dig into some of these elements of sacrifice and kind of the mechanics of what's happening behind the scenes here in the Leviticus 23 and the festivals and what's happening, because I think there's some good stuff in there that we don't want to miss.
Right. I mean, it's a little bit hard to kind of say super broad strokes just because there are so many different kinds of sacrifice. There's atoning and non-atoning. There's voluntary and mandatory. There's animal and vegetal. Like it's so difficult just to kind of create a whole a thing that just covers it all. But having said that, and given that caveat, I generally think that there are just two basic aspects of most every sacrifice. And because I love alliteration, they always alliterate. So it's on the one hand, there's a burning ritual, which involves some form of consecration, things passing through the fire, being purified, being set apart from the realm of flesh and decaying, moving into the realm of purity and holiness. And then a bonding ritual, a burning ritual and a bonding ritual, or in a different alliterative framing, consecration and communion. So there's basically those two elements in play. So like that bonding ritual is both the application of the blood that becomes like an index bond, like for example, that's why it gets applied to the altar, which that's exactly what happens in the covenant and inauguration ceremony. The blood is dipped into the hyssop branch is dipped into the blood, and then it's sprinkled on the people, it's sprinkled on the book, it's sprinkled on the altar, it's sprinkled on all the furniture of all the sacred space and the tabernacle itself. And so there's this kind of like bonding happening between the people and the stuff. And the idea there is that whatever happens to the people also happens to the stuff, also happens to the furniture. So if there's some kind of impurity in the people, residing in the people, it transfers or it connects or it causes they're entangled, they're quantumly entangled with the altar, if you wish, or something like that. And so that that bonding ritual is the application of the blood, but it also becomes a purifying thing where, by applying it to the furniture, that cleanses the furniture. And the people have to be clean themselves to be able to do that, which is what repentance does. Or else they'll just bring more impurity on there. So it kind of creates this constant catch-22 loop. So basically there are those two elements in play. And like, for instance, with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, there is the Shalomim, which is the well-being offering or the peace offering. And that one kind of follows that same sort of model where there is the initial elements that are presented, and then the slaughter of the animal, and then it's laid on the altar, or at least not the animal whole, because Phil talked about this last time. It gets divided and portioned, and then the memorial portion gets laid on the altar. So it's not a dead animal anymore. It is a transfigured holy thing that then gets sent up to the mountain of the Lord. And so that's that burning or that consecration element. And then there's also the communion element. And that's what in the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the ongoing kind of Passover remembrance cycle, that's what would happen is the people would eat of that sacrifice. And it became this like kind of communal feast that everybody would partake of, because you had to eat it in only 3 days. Like on the third day, it had to be burned up by fire. It had to be ritually disposed of as a holy thing. And if they didn't get that done, then they would have to, get rid of it. So because of that, it's really hard for one family to eat like, a whole animal. And so they would bring everybody, multiple households in, which, by the way, is exactly what happened in the original Passover. It was not one lamb, one firstborn. And that's another reason why the whole substitutionary frame doesn't work. It was one lamb for as many as needed. That's it. And that could be one, that could be 20. Who knew? So
I had a thought, but I can't remember what it was. All this, by the way, in Leviticus 23 is happening after, or it's set within the context of after you enter the land.
Thank you.
Which is important, that it's not,
Right.
You have to do this so that I will bless you, or you must do this so that I will rescue you. The rescue has already happened. And Leviticus 23 says, say to them, when you enter the land. That's talking about the offering of first fruits, but it's in the same section. It's talking about Sabbath and Passover. That after you enter the land and you're experiencing living as my people in my land with the new blessings, then you will give back to me from what I've given to you. So even the gift of the first fruits is like, they may have been living there for a couple of years before they had any harvest. So they don't have to bring anything to God, any offerings to God, until they've received, and then they give an offering of thanks. And I think that the Passover is a similar idea, that the rescue has already happened, but they're sharing in a meal, which is, like we just said before, it's a remembrance or a memorial. And so they're participating in that event with their ancestors, with the nation of Israel, and with Yahweh himself. But they're doing it within the covenant promises and the covenant land of Yahweh.
Which was fully a gift at the hands of Yahweh. And so one of the things he says over and over is like, you're not getting this land because you were righteous or because you were special in any way. He's like, I'm just doing this because I loved Abraham and the rest of your fathers. And so that whole, which just reinforces that whole paradigm of sacrifices as reciprocal gift giving, of like that the people give to God out of the gifts that he has given to them, and then they give it right, and then he gives it right back to them. I was having a small group with some people from my church on Friday, and we were talking about the sacrifices in Leviticus, and then I was holding up like a little thing that my daughter made. She loves to make like little crafty things, and they're just out of pieces of paper. They don't really look like much because she's 8 and still learning how to make things. But I think they're wonderful and I treasure them. But so I don't need it, but it's a gift that she's giving out of her love for me. And she's making it out of paper that I bought, tape that I bought, markers that I bought, all these sort of things. So like she's taking things that I have given her out of my generosity and then giving it to me out of her generosity. And then I give things back to her, love, affection, attention, all those other kind of things out of my generosity. Like that's the sacrificial model.
That sounds.
And you might put that thing on your wall or on your desk
Yes,
at work.
right.
And it sits there as a memorial. Yep.
Yes, to always bring her to front of mind, not because I've forgotten about her. Oh yeah, that's right, I forgot I was a dad. Oh man.
Oh no.
But because everything else is demanding my attention, it's great when she is right there. Go ahead, Josh.
Yep. Oh, I was just going to say that the logic you described there is exactly the kind of reciprocal logic you have with the more ritual understanding of the Lord's Supper as the Eucharist, right? It's God giving us the good things in life and us bringing making bread and wine out of wheat and the grape and bringing that, and then God then makes that into something that we could never make it into. And as we partake of that, we are partaking of the body and blood of Christ. And there are obviously different ways people understand that, but in that logic, like it's who's getting the greater gift, right? And who's the one originally giving the gift? It's like, well, everything we're giving is giving God, back to God, something he already gave us. But then it's like he does something to it that we can never do. Right. And you see examples of that. And this is why some of the early Christian artwork around the Eucharist, you have, loaves and fish. Right, because they're looking at that parable of Jesus takes the loaves and the fish, and then it's like they're multiplied. There's something that they could never do with it, right? And God does that in providing for us in ways that we could never do. So very meaningful and just very, very meaningful. And looking at that exchange.
Well, and I wanted to tie that back to the previous conversation about submission. So if for some reason I told my daughter, I want you to make me a gift, something like that. And do I expect her to do that? Probably, yes. Will I really have a consequence if she doesn't? Probably not. But unless she goes about it a certain way, unless she's like, I'm not going to do what you tell me to, Dad. I'll do what I want, then of course we have a whole different dynamic in play. So it matters immensely who you are submitting to. And it's really important to look at these ritualized texts and the sets of laws and look at it in that light of father to children. Yeah.
It can have relational consequences, even if it's not legal consequences. If you will.
Yep.
Right, which I think moves into as Spencer kind of was talking about the pieces there. I want to stop for a second and talk about two different parts of that. One being the hyssop, and the other being the meat and the cooking of the meat. So first, the hyssop. This is really kind of fun to look at because I didn't really know the significance of the hyssop either when we were starting this one. So, digging into a little bit, it is this small aromatic plant that has a lot of little hairy stems and white flowers on it. And in the ancient Near East, outside the context of the Old Testament and inside obviously too, but it is used for ceremonial purification. That was its job. It was dipped into a liquid like blood or water, and the branches would collect that moisture, which is kind of cool. That's what the little hairy stems kind of did, was grab that liquid, right? And then it was used to sprinkle either applied to or shaken in the direction of the object. And then that would be the transfer of that liquid from the hyssop to that object. Precisely exactly botanically what hyssop was, we're not completely sure. But, it does have uses not only in ceremonial things, but it also has a culinary use. So, but in a, gosh, I just got distracted. Hang on a second. Oh, good grief. just totally threw me off. Hang on a second.
Like like the plant that they think it is like the plant that's makes up za'atar. If people are familiar with that, like Arab seasoning blend.
I am not, but
Yeah.
now I want to eat it.
Oh, it's good. It's good. Yeah. I get like a za'atar fatayer at like our local kind of Greek place. I don't know.
Yeah. Za'atar is really good. We actually have that. Okay, I'm going to move on from that thought because it doesn't matter. So yeah, again, in ancient times, it's regarded having both medicinal and culinary value, and it also has a role in ceremonial purification. So it kind of has this broad everywhere into a lot of the areas of life. You're going to encounter it all over the place. It's going to be what you take to heal yourself. It's going to season your food, and it's going to cleanse your space all the way around. So it is just kind of a multi-use thing, but it is like everything else in the ancient world. God brings that along with them, pulls it out, and sanctifies it for His use, and says, "Yeah, it was used this way, but I'm going to make it even better and use it in all of these Levitical practices and in that kind of thing." So I don't know if we need to go into hyssop any more than that, because it's kind of just a
I mean, it is
cool little
interesting to me that
Yeah.
you then have John including a detail in the gospel that that's the kind of branch that was used to raise up the sponge with the vinegar to Christ on the cross.
Oh,
Right.
yeah. Good
Like,
catch.
I don't know what to do exactly with that, but there does seem to be that. I feel like there are multiple places in the Gospels where you get a sense of kind of the inversion of what's supposed to be in the way that things are done. So, here you have the Sanhedrin essentially supposed to be the mirror of the heavenly divine council, who condemns the head of the council, right? That's an inversion, right? You have things like this where it's like hyssop is meant to be used for cleansing, and now we're going to use it to, and like some of these things are a little hard to track, and I haven't done any kind of deep study on this, but it is interesting to me that it does kind of feel like something that was meant to be used for cleansing and for these kind of positive aspects of ritual that's now being used to do something that is in fact very negative. Yeah.
Right. That's an interesting thought, because it's not like Christ's sacrifice needed to be cleansed.
Right. You're right.
Or healed. Like that's not
Yeah.
that's not imagery that we're working with here. But that the specific mention of it being hyssop is significant, because they don't mention things that aren't significant.
Although the human passions did. And it comes right after Christ says, "I thirst."
Right.
So there's perhaps some connections there, but it's also worth considering that like hyssop. So like there's that passage in Psalm 51, the famous one that David, where David's lamenting after Bathsheba, and he says, "Purge me with hyssop, and I will be clean." And of course, he's identifying, he's using sacrificial register of terms, because that he's referring to that sense of like purging from corpse pollution that we see in Leviticus 14, in Numbers 19. Sorry. And he's using that idea to say like, you alone, God, are able to purge this sin from me, because he had committed 2 of the 3 like unsacrificable sins. He had adultery and murder. And so he had not, there was no sacrifice available that would purge him. And so he realized that the only thing that would purge him was this like divine sprinkling through God's own hand. It was not something that the hand of man could purge him from. So
that's interesting. Wow. I haven't to think about that for a while.
Well,
Phil,
and you
cooking
think about
of
that.
meat. Oh, okay.
I was just going to say, think about that, like that essentially like divine, like, sympathy, as it were. In Psalm 69, which is one of the Psalms that kind of looks forward to the cross, you have, how I am scorned, disgraced, and shamed. All my enemies are before you. Scorn has broken my heart and has left me helpless. I looked for sympathy, but there was none. For comforters, but I found none. They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst. right? And so that's like, again, that kind of inversion of where David is looking for someone to bring healing, and Christ is on the cross looking for someone to minister to him, and instead he receives this, right? And yeah, just very like yeah.
It's almost like the Bible has multiple layers of meaning.
Indeed.
Yes. And on that parting shot, I will have to tap out. So thank you all
All
very
right.
much for
Thank you,
letting me do that.
Spencer. Thank you very much. All right. And as he's on his way out, let's go over to the cooking of the meat, because I think it's really interesting that it's all cooked in fire. There's a specific, like, not boil it. Don't boil it. It needs to be cooked with fire all over the place. So, Phil, this is where we're going to let you take it away, because you're going to know more about this than I do, for sure. Phil, you're up.
Yeah, to be honest, it's something that I haven't looked into as much as I should have. But yes, it seems like it's a contradiction, because the first time they're told to boil it, and then in Deuteronomy, isn't it, they're told to cook it with fire. But I think that's the difference between the first time, where it wasn't connected to, like we said, to the fire, to the altar. It was totally a gift from God to the people. And yeah, so to be boiled in a pot specifically. And then is it Deuteronomy where the instruction seems to contradict what it said in Exodus? But it says that it should be roasted over a fire. And that's not the altar, because that's God's altar. But I think that it's a recalling of what happened in Egypt. But it's changing the ritual so that it's now roasting. But yeah, to be honest, I haven't looked into it as much as I need to.
All right, that's okay. That's do you either, Courtney or Josh, do you have any thoughts on that, or can we jump into the really good part here at the that Josh has been dying to get to the entire time? All right, moving ahead, we're going to jump into, I want to get into like these feasts, these festivals, especially Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because it seems to me, and we've touched on it a little bit, but I really want to dig into this because I think it's important, with the idea of being brought out under the ownership of Yahweh, and this idea of submission bringing freedom in a way that's totally different than we understand. There's a lot of like messianic significance there, and it really seems like it is anchored and tied to the connection between Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Eucharist. And like this is something that I really want to camp on for a little bit. So Sherman, I'm gonna let you take it away. And
I mean, there's so many different, kind of pieces to this, and I'm sure there are many that I'm forgetting. But I think for me, one of the things that gets really interesting is that you have this connection into essentially, remembering, we're remembering Christ's victory, his resurrection, right? So on Sunday, you had Christians that started to gather in the morning in order to memorialize this, in order to remember this, in order to celebrate this. And what did they do, right? They did what Jesus said to do. He said, when you gather, when you're remembering my death, when you're remembering me, and he broke the bread and he took the cup and he did these things. And so Christians did this to gather in order to remember this. You also have an interesting layer here where, it's like, what exactly does it mean, right? When Jesus uses exactly the same things that Melchizedek brings out to Abraham, and uses them in a way that seems very priestly, because he brings it out, he offers this to Abraham, and then he brings blessing, which is a blessing from heaven, right, to Abraham. And what does it mean to then say that Christ is a priest in the order of Melchizedek? It's like, well, in a priestly order, you're going to have certain ways you do things, right? And one of the things that I think we see kind of set up there is that the offerings that are brought by Christ are the same offering that you have of Melchizedek that he brings out to Abraham, and that this is part of the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's just kind of tied into how we look at this and how we understand what Jesus was doing when he initiates this supper with his disciples, and tying that into Passover, tying that into our recollection of the redemption that Jesus has brought through his not only life and death, but also his resurrection, his ascension, and his priestly offering. So there's just a lot of kind of stuff packed into all of that. I would be interested to hear, other people's thoughts as different angles or aspects of that have caught their attention.
Okay. Wow, that was a lot of really good stuff there. I'm trying to figure out which rabbit trail to go.
Right? I'm just going to throw out rabbit trails and see where you want to go.
Wow, I think where I want to go first, really, and thinking about this whole idea, because I just can't move off of the fact that there's so much imagery, garden to garden, about remembering together over a communal meal, submitted properly to Yahweh, is the essence of dwelling in community with Yahweh and with each other. Like, that is the Edenic ideal of this properly ordered submission community meal together. And that was echoed in the observance of Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it was amplified infinitum in the death, burial, and resurrection, and now commemorated in the Eucharist. Like, that to me just resonates so loudly out of these feasts and festivals.
Well, and it seems to be that essentially this is what the continuation of what Eden was supposed to be like is, as we're living life now. And you see the inversion of that, right, with partaking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is an act of rebellion, not submission, right? And I mean, you could argue to some extent that it was potentially even an act of communion with the wrong divine being, right? With the serpent saying, "Oh, you should take of this. Like, I'm going to offer this to you, even though it's not mine to give," right? And so I do think that there's very much a sense of, like, this is the continuation of what should be, and it's also the reversal of what broke things.
So it looks like it's a diversion of submission to the redirection of self. But like, there's so many, my brain, like, rabbit trails in my head. I'm having so much trouble containing any of it to even focus on a thought here, because my brain is going so many directions.
But as you think about, like, as we partake of that, right, as we're doing that in the proper way, as we have the proper submission, as we have the proper communion with God, we are partaking of Christ, who is the tree of life. Right. So again, tying back into Edenic imagery, right? And so there's layer after layer of things here that really tie into this, and it's it can be a little bit hard to even begin to dig under.
Right. But I really want to, I think, focus, because I need to focus my thoughts here in the comparison of the two. These two feasts together, because Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread remind us and have us sit in what's happening in the Exodus event and the birth of Israel and the God's redemption and reclaiming and cosmic reclaiming, what becomes the cosmic reclaiming, and the Eucharist or communion, depending on what your tradition is. Like, there's the connection there, and the whole point and the whole purpose. I don't think that it's even different at all. Like, we remember an event that we sit together and linger over a meal together, and the power of that, resubmitting ourselves properly in that freedom of being bought and paid for and owned in Christ. As in the Old Testament, they were transfer of ownership to Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just think there's so much rich beauty in that echo and that symbolism.
Yeah, I'm trying to the part that I'm hitting bottom on right now is the contrast between the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then what that all, connecting all of that ends. So that's something I'm gonna have to just spend a bit more time kind of sitting with. But it is interesting how much these rituals shape who we are as people. And I think with the Eucharist, the idea is that this is shaping us together communally into the body of Christ, right? So there's a sense of that kind of renewal and connecting back into new creation, into new birth, into baptism, these ideas, but also just, again, like, it's not just each of us individually connecting in with God and being like, now I'm right with God, yay, but it's all of us together. And what does it look like for us to do that, and then to be free people in Christ who can then operate as people that represent God to the people around us?
Right. Which is going to take us back to the slowness of relationship building, because you can't get, we as people, as humans, don't experience this instant. We just don't. And God set that up even in creation. Why time? It part of, I think, the creation narrative is to show that time is needed for relationship building, because an all-powerful God could have spoke a word and the entire thing, poof, there it is. But in this experience of time, God is setting the stage and showing the slowness of developing relationship that has to be cultivated through time. And that's part of sitting down for a meal, sitting down at the Passover, sitting down at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, sitting down at the Eucharist together. Slowness of participation with God and with each other.
Absolutely.
Courtney, what you got?
Oh,
I know
well,
you got something good over there.
I don't know if I have anything good, but just in terms of these two feasts, like Passover, with the Paschal Lamb and the Feast of Unleavened Bread being brought together, that's exactly how Paul relates them together in 1 Corinthians, where he's referring to the one, how you deal with people who've committed sexual immorality in the midst of the congregation. And so, and he says, oh, you're assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus, and my spirit's present. So he's invoking some like real presence of Christ in the midst of their assembly is the means by which they have the authority and his own authority, his own apostolic authority to get rid of the offender from their midst. But he says, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of a malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So he brings them both together as the means and the reason for which they are currently gathering, and therefore the authority on which they have to like cleanse, people who are being wantonly sinful in their midst, right? So there's a lot to probably tease out there, but those are very much active motifs that sit together in Paul's mind, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover, and that Christ is the new Passover lamb.
Can I comment quickly on a couple of things from the chat? The idea of Sabbath being on a particular day, something that's really struck me is that the idea of Sabbath is release. So Jubilee is all about freeing slaves, giving the land back, not doing any work, but that's acknowledging that everything is Yahweh's. Time is Yahweh's. The whole earth is Yahweh's. And so I think when Jesus announces this is the year of the Jubilee, he's announcing a release. So everything that had been enslaved is now free. And I think what Jesus is hinting at is that now it's a perpetual release. It's not just one day a year that you do it, but it's like now we are living in the time of release where everyone that was a slave to sin, or that was a slave under Pharaoh, or whatever the tyrannical ruler of the day was, Jesus' work is to release that. And so we're living in a time of Jubilee release. So we may, like the Jewish custom, remember that as our own kind of sacred time or annual remembering of that. But I think the goal and the idea is that we're living in a perpetual, eternal time of release. And that's kind of related to the other thing, which was another comment, that when Jesus does Passover with his disciples, he calls it, this is my blood of the new covenant. And the first Passover wasn't a covenant. Well, it's not said that it was a covenant meal, even though I think that we're supposed to look back at it and see it as a pre or a proto-covenant meal. While they were in Egypt, it was a proto-covenant meal. But then once they're out of Egypt at Sinai, they have the actual covenant meal when they're sprinkled with the actual covenant blood. And I think that's what Jesus is doing by tying the two together. So he is the Passover lamb. However, his blood is the covenant blood, the new covenant in his blood, which purifies us. So we get to participate in the rescue as the Passover lamb. And in doing that, in being rescued from slavery, we are being marked as God's covenant people.
You saying that, Phil, just like made me have this thought. Does the Passover participate in the covenant that he established with Abraham? Like, is that the meal that it's participating in? It's not participating in the Sinai covenant, but participating in, if he's remembering the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which he does commemorate with a meal after the sign of circumcision in Genesis 18. So is it participating in like that meal? I wonder. Because it's like says in Exodus 12 that they brought up the bones of Joseph, and Joseph says, like right as he's dying in Genesis 50, just as God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's going to bring you up out of this place and make sure you bring my bones with you when he brings you up out of this place. So it makes me wonder if like, because of the connection of Joseph dying in Egypt and his bones and the bones with taking them up out of Passover, like in that first Passover, if that meal is actually participating backwards.
Yeah, I've been wondering that for quite a while.
Like
Back
both
when we did our
even.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been wondering that, actually pondering that since our first episode, that this idea of which covenant are we actually talking about here? And Jesus is referring back to this idea because it doesn't make narrative sense. It makes more narrative sense that he is reclaiming the covenant of Abraham.
Because like Moses needed a certain kind of circumcision in order to be able to basically officiate in this way. In Exodus chapter 4.
Again, something that, I've had the same questions and I haven't really arrived on a good answer. But it seems like blood of the covenant was definitely Exodus and the covenant at Sinai. That was my coffee that just.
Oh, I agree with that. I agree with your Jesus connection to Sinai.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if
thinking,
like the Passover, the historical Passover.
Yeah.
Actually,
but also, doesn't Paul mention hyssop in relation to covenant? I'm having a mental blank, but Paul mentions hyssop again in the New Testament. Where a detail that wasn't in Exodus. He says that the people were sprinkled with the blood.
Oh, in Hebrews it's mentioned.
Yeah, Hebrews.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Hebrews. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's Paul, isn't it?
It is to me, but people argue.
For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people. So that's definitely referring to Sinai.
Yeah. So hyssop, hyssop and scarlet wool is the ritual of the two birds in Leviticus. But it's a detail that's not mentioned in Exodus, which I find fascinating.
I just had a thought. I wondered what you guys think about this. This is live stream processing, so this could be a train wreck. But I was thinking about this witch covenant question because I wonder if there's some mechanic that this is a I don't know, a mashup of a sequence of the covenants, because you got the Abrahamic covenant is the promise to redeem everyone,
Mhm.
but the Sinai covenant is the setting apart as Israel as the vehicle that's going to get us there.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
seeing it more of a chiasm and not just a linear progression. You
right.
have almost like a sense of it,
hmm
you know.
Or a hinge, like maybe
Yeah.
not a
Mhm.
chiasm, but a
Right.
hinge.
Right. A
Yeah.
hinge.
Midpoint.
That's more what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he's synthesizing and saying a new covenant, because it's not the covenant that start it. I'm fulfilling and broadening, or whatever word you want to use there. I don't, because that's not a fully formed thought yet. The Abrahamic covenant to promise to bless all nations through Abraham.
Mhm.
How's he going to do that? Well, the Sinai covenant is how we start that, by setting apart Israel, which is the vehicle that is going to bring the line. We're pulling in the line of the Messiah, and there's a lot of threads, and so taking all those threads, it's not just like mashed potatoes of covenants. He's like, I'm going to take it and I'm making it a whole new thing, because I'm synthesizing stuff that works but doesn't work
Mm.
in a way that works but shouldn't work.
I mean,
And that
it
was
just
what makes it a
reminds
new
me.
thing.
It just reminds me of Paul in Romans 9-11 and Jason Staples' approach to that, and recognizing like there's a sense in which the promises to Abraham are fulfilled with all Israel being saved by not just the remnant of Judah and Benjamin and Levi, but also the scattered 10 tribes being brought back in through the ingathering of the nations. And then also people that are gathered in the nations that were not even like, there isn't like a blending, like there's all of this kind of sense of bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And what does it mean when Paul quotes Exodus 34 or Exodus 33:19, which is echoing 34:6 and 7, where he defines himself and his faithfulness and his mercy, and then Paul goes on to describe, it's like, no, like you guys don't understand, God's mercy is bigger than you think. And so yeah, I mean, I could see us all of those things kind of getting pulled together, and part of the question then becomes like, what does it hinge on, right? Because when Jesus instantiates the Lord's Supper, right, he says, in this way, like when Paul reflects on Jesus instantiating, he says, in this way we're remembering or proclaiming Christ's death until he comes again, right? And a lot of people then focus that and say, see, like it's the death that's the focus, and I'm going to focus on the cross, and that's the only way I'm going to kind of see this. There's my proof text for certain views of atonement. I would like to contrast that with the way that Melito talks about it in Non Pascha, because he has a very I'm going to go back to this again, right? Because again, I mean, this is considered one of the oldest Passover Haggadahs that we have that was written down, right? So there obviously were, this is what we do in Passover that people were practicing long before this came around. But when we get down to what's been written down, this was essentially kind of the first Christian approach to writing down something that tells us this is the meaning of this for us. And he says, the Lord clothed himself with humanity and with suffering on behalf of the suffering one, and bound on the behalf of the one constrained, and judged on behalf of the one convicted, and buried on behalf of the one entombed. He rose from the dead and cried aloud, right? So that part sounds a whole lot like what people want to focus on. But then you have, continuing on, he says, who takes issue with me? Let him stand before me. I set free the condemned. I gave life to the dead. I raised up the entombed. Who will contradict me? It is I, says the Christ. I am he who destroys death and triumphs over the enemy, and crushes Hades, and binds the strong man, and bears humanity off to the heavenly heights. And he keeps going, right? But like, when we remember Christ's death, is that not part of what we're supposed to be remembering? I would say it is, right? That we're remembering, as Hebrews talks about, him conquering the power of death through death, right? That is more than just the way that a lot of people look at it, where they say Christ suffering on the cross, that's the moment, end of story, now I can move on, right? That this is bringing a whole lot more, and bringing a whole lot more Passover imagery and deliverance imagery to our understanding of what that even means when we gather together and proclaim and remember Christ's death until he comes.
Yeah, and what Jesus said, so Paul says we proclaim and we remember his death,
Yeah.
but Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me.
Yeah.
Which, like,
Yeah.
I don't think he was talking about just his death. He's saying, remember me, like my whole life, the whole, like our meal together right now, everything that I've done while I was among you.
Yes.
Do this in remembrance of me.
Yes. And the remembrance of the things that Israel did in remembrance of were part of their sacrificial system that God sets up to help them through the cycle of feasts and to remember the deliverance that God accomplished for them from Egypt. Right. So again, it's like, it's not just remembrance of like, boy, Jesus was a great guy, you know, but it's like, remember what I've accomplished. Remember what I've done. Remember who I am. Like all of that is wrapped up in that. Right. Remember my Passover. Right.
And then if we think again about that blood is life in that sacrificial context, we are remembering his life, and we're also consuming and participating in his life, which is pretty special.
Absolutely.
Well, and it's also really like Sherman's point should not be like glossed over, that we think of death and we think of like the cross and the bloodiness of it the way that it was kind of taught in my tradition. But for Paul, and in the book of Hebrews, also Paul, that when we think of death, we should think of resurrection and the conquering of death. Like in 1 Corinthians 15, he's like, we should be pitied of all people if there was no resurrection. And he goes on this really long exposition on what death is like and then what resurrection is like. So whenever we think of Christ's death, we should like map directly onto that, his conquering of death and his resurrection. So we can't really, like, we shouldn't ever leave death as the only word when talking about Christ, which I think is something that could be said of like an unfortunate thing that could be said maybe of like the preaching tradition that I inherited, you know, was that we often left Christ's death as the main word.
Yep.
And then what do you do with, and he was raised for our justification, especially if justification has a certain meaning for you, like it starts to get kind of complicated and confusing. Yeah.
Right. But if your entire salvation is accomplished when he's dying or death on a cross, then there really isn't a need to talk about resurrection.
Or that he sits as high priest forever, interceding.
Or as high priest for his intercessory role forever. Or even like, how does our resurrection participate in that?
Yep.
And so then you get kind of the disembodied view of heaven that was at least my predominant model growing up, was like, okay, whenever I die, that is my salvation. And there's not this life after death. That is the resurrection.
Right. All right. So, no, I think she's talking about the Pascha book, Josh. That
Yep.
you've
Oh,
been
it's
talking about.
On Pascha with Melito
Yeah.
Sardis in the popular patristic series.
All right. So if we have, I want to run through. We had a few questions that come in that I've been starring, and we can do those real quick, and then we'll wrap up. So, the first one, Deborah asked us way back in the beginning: is the wheat and the barley an example of how someone grows in their understanding because one grows faster than the other? That's an interesting idea. I would have to look into that. I don't see an immediate connection to that. I think it's more tied to sustained provision, but I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Okay.
I just think in general you have crops that come up at different times, and so and you want your crops to be coming up at different times of the year.
Right.
You know.
All right. And then Josh had to, he had to leave. But what are your thoughts on Kip Davis's ideas about Yahweh's inheritance and the development of monotheism? I have not read that book, so I can't comment at all on that.
I can't comment on that specifically. I'm wondering if what he's referring to is the idea that the Most High in Deuteronomy 32 is not Yahweh, and then Yahweh was given his portion as an inheritance, and that signals a development of monotheism. If that's the idea, then I could see that being something that is a development of the understanding of some people of it. I would not look at that as the meaning of Deuteronomy 32. I think it's very clear in Scripture when you have talk about the Most High. It's very consistently Yahweh that's being referred to, and any other kind of superlative things. So you think Most High, you think Creator, you think all of these kinds of things. These tend to be ascribed to Yahweh within Scripture, and there are also places where other divine epithets that may be connected with other deities like Baal are ascribed to Yahweh as well. And that's not like saying Yahweh is Baal or anything like that, but it's basically saying like in the culture around you, people are saying this about Baal, but this is actually something that can be said most truthfully about Yahweh, right? So that Yahweh is the one who is the rider on the clouds, that Yahweh is the creator, Yahweh is the Most High, right? So I would not typically read it in that way. I do think you could potentially see it as being something that might be understood by the culture around Israel if they're reading something like Deuteronomy 32 or Psalm 82 in terms of a polemic. But again, that's a different question than how the people that are in Israel, that are part of the faithful people of God, would have understood it and what it was meant to communicate originally as it was written. Hopefully that's helpful.
Right. Yeah, I haven't read the book at all, so I have no.
I mean, I think Kip Davis is more of like at least I don't know if he's got a book about it, but he's got a YouTube channel. So might be
and I
talking about some of his thoughts on his YouTube channel.
Yeah, maybe. And I know he's a Hebrew scholar who was a Christian and now is an atheist, if that's who I think he's talking about also. So that could be part of the monotheistic thread
Which
there.
would fit pretty well with what I'm thinking he's probably talking about. But again, I'm a little bit stab in the dark because I'm not familiar with that person.
I don't know. Okay. So, and then he asked one more question before he left. In Exodus 25, people are asked to give based on the willingness of their heart. Is there a secret test happening here for good hearts or no? I don't think so. God doesn't set us up to fail. So it's not like a secret pass-fail test exactly. So I don't think so.
I don't know that it would be any more specific than just the test of the heart and sacrifice in general, right?
Yeah.
Yahweh's not very interested in sacrifices that are brought with an eye towards bribery or anything else. He wants people to be bringing these because they're bringing a gift in that reciprocal sense of relationship and faithfulness. And so if there's any logic to it that's kind of like that, I would say it's probably just very consistent with what he looks at with sacrifice in general. It's just that this might be described a little more specifically as like, oh yeah, like, you have a choice to bring, because there are certain offerings that it's like, this is what you're supposed to do in the morning and in the evening and at this time and this feast and this thing. And then there are also offerings that are, I want to bring something to Yahweh, right? And all of those are meant to be gifts that are establishing and kind of heightening that reciprocal relationship. But I think the free will ones, which is often how that's translated, tend to be even more so that sense of like, hey, like, I don't even have to do this, but like, God is good, like I'm going to go to his house and I'm going to, yeah.
It may be, so in Leviticus, there's lots about, you bring what you can. So if you're poor, there's no requirement to bring an ox or a lamb if you can't afford it. So it could just be whatever the willingness of your heart is, that's acceptable. Even if you're really poor and all you can bring is a handful of flour, or when they're dedicating the temple, everyone brought gifts. If you can't, bring a massive pot of gold or whatever, you just bring a couple of earrings, then that's great. That's still
acceptable. It is Yeah, important to note that, like, specifically Exodus 25 is talking about bringing things forward to build the tabernacle. And so it gives like a whole
Mhm.
list of things that are appropriate gifts for the tabernacle. And so I think it does connect to those free will offerings of like whatever you can bring. It's not, if you think about like the way we've been taught to like test our hearts, it's like I'm doing this thing that would be considered good and I do love God, but then I need to test my heart to see if I'm actually genuinely loving God while doing this thing, while giving to this charity or something like that. And that kind of introspection or circumspection really isn't in view there. It's just like whatever, if you look around your possessions and of this list of, ram skins, goat skins, acacia wood, um, purple and blue yarn, if you got any of that stuff and
Mm.
it seems good to you to bring it, then
Yeah.
bring it forward because we're going to build the tabernacle now.
Yep.
Go ahead. Sorry, I just had
Oh
a
yeah,
thought.
so
But
it's more about that and not just like
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
bring it if you have the purest of intentions of bringing this to make a house for Yahweh.
Mhm.
It's not
I-
doing that.
I'm wondering if that's participatory building of community consensus. Like I have ownership because I participated and I contributed something, even if it was just the 3 pieces of thread that I have, or I had 6 bundles of it in the back, like whatever
Mhm.
it was. It's sweat equity. I participated in this because I contributed and I gave to it, and that builds the community relationship and the relationship with Yahweh. It's kind of a horizontal and a vertical participation. That's
Mm.
what I'm wondering about that. Okay. One more, and then we're going to wrap up here. So Deborah wants to know, okay, with the sentiment or statement, when you said Sunday Christians, does that mean Sabbath was only for the Jews? Because we know that Sabbath was not Sunday. So
I kind of
Sabbath,
touched on that before. We're talking about
right?
Jubilee and Day of
Right.
Release. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I do think it's important to recognize historically, there are different understandings of how to understand the relationship between those 2 days, right? So you go back and look at some of the things like Westminster Confession, you're going to see people basically saying that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, right? But then, you go back a little further and you start getting into some of the early stuff that we have from people like Justin Martyr, people writings on the Didache and other things. And they very much see a clear distinction between those 2 days. And it's a distinction that has been preserved to this day in languages like Greek and Spanish and other things. You have, Sabbath and you have the Lord's Day, right? And those are clearly not understood to be the same day when we're talking about early Christians. So, generally speaking, what was happening with people that were Jewish believers is that they would be going to synagogue and gathering for a Sabbath, and then they would be coming together, usually fairly early on Sunday morning. Often it would be before work because it was a work day for them until that was declared to not be a work day by Constantine. And they would gather and they would partake of the Lord's Supper, of the Eucharist together. They would have different prayers and things that they would do, right? So definitely 2 different things that we're talking about historically early on, even though there are times when you start to see people starting to kind of blend them together, maybe in a spiritual manner or with some kind of language like that.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is right. The Sunday became the Resurrection Sunday, the beginning of the new week, and it was something that Christians identified as like Resurrection Sunday. But again, whatever tradition you're in, you might participate with that Sabbath Saturday, which is more of participating with that Jewish idea of a weekly rest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I'm realizing is that the participation with that rich historical practice, there's not really a right way to do it. Like in my tradition, communion is too relaxed, and that makes me really sad. We don't do it every week, and I wish we did. But it's okay. Maybe it's not ideal, but it's okay. But doing it on a different day, I think, is you're acknowledging your Jewish roots, and you're participating in a Jewish Sabbath ritual, like as a memorial day, which like is super important. If you're going to do Sunday as a memorial day, which not many Christians do, then that's great. But acknowledge that it's a Sunday, it's a resurrection Sunday. But if you're going to do a Saturday as a memorial day, then acknowledge your Jewish roots and do it as a Jewish style Shabbat. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
All right, that's the end of our questions. So we're gonna final thoughts, and then we are gonna wrap up and be out of here. So we're gonna start with Courtney, and we're gonna go around the horn. I will give my final thoughts last, and then we'll channel promos and be done. So Courtney, final thoughts.
Yeah, final thoughts. I think one thing that really comes out the more that you study sacrifices, or the more that at least I've studied sacrifices, is just the emphasis on time and how to be careful about it and to be watchful and mindful of it. And so therefore this and it's these are celebrations, right? These are feasts. And we should care that they are feasts and celebrate them as such. And so there's been a lot of Easter services that I've had, or which are Passover, celebrating the Passover, celebrating the feast of being saved through the waters of baptism and resurrected with new life, that feel very Good Friday. And so if there's one small thing we can leave you with, is that, like, remember, Passover is celebrating the victory of God over the forces of death and darkness and bringing you into newness of life. And so, like, let's make Easter again, and do that, not to be too political or anything like that, but like let's actually celebrate life and like not just focus on death whenever we celebrate Easter. So I mean, I think some of that can be hard. I think because of some of the ways that we tend to present the good news of Easter, we tend to really focus on the death quite a bit. But these should be feasts, and they should have that kind of festal character to them, happiness. Nobody's sad at Christmas, for instance, so we should have that kind of brightness of the Easter Sunday morning on our faces whenever we celebrate Easter. So if we're thinking about how we do this like once a year in our church communities, that would probably be the thing that leave us with, is that like marking the time is really important. We're participating in the resurrection and the victory of Jesus whenever we celebrate the same victory that he did 2,000 years ago, and that we need to keep that same festal character and don't conflate Friday with Sunday.
Amen.
All right, Josh, final thoughts.
Is it a surprise that I'm going to read a little more?
I'm shocked, absolutely shocked.
To continue on to the end on Pascha. This is in the voice of Christ. So come, all families of people adulterated with sin, and receive forgiveness of sins. For I am your freedom. I am the Passover of salvation. I am the lamb slaughtered for you. I am your ransom. I am your life. I am your light. I am your salvation. I am your resurrection. I am your king. I shall raise you up on my right hand. I will lead you to the heights of heaven, and there shall I show you the everlasting Father. He it is who made the heaven and the earth, and formed humanity in the beginning, who was proclaimed through the law and the prophets, who took flesh from a virgin, who was hung on a tree, who was buried in earth, who was raised from the dead, and ascended to the heights of heaven, who sits at the right hand of the Father, who has the power to save all things, through whom the Father acted from the beginning and forever. This is the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the ineffable beginning and incomprehensible end. This is the Christ, this is the King, this is Jesus, this is the Commander, this is the Lord, this is he who rose from the dead, this is he who sits at the right hand of the Father. He bears the Father and is born by him. To him be the glory and the might forever. Amen. So, yes, celebrating victory is a big part of understanding the Passover the way it was historically understood for Christians.
All right, awesome. Phil, final thoughts.
Yeah. So the sun's up here. You might have seen that my face is a bit brighter now. I actually spoke at a Catholic church yesterday, and we were thinking about the altar. So the altar faces east today, towards the rising sun, anticipating the return of Jesus. But the tabernacle, they went in towards the west, back in towards the garden. But so I think it's fascinating that now, as Jesus has embodied Passover and the Passover lamb, but he's taking that imagery and saying, this is actually my blood of the new covenant, that we're now almost facing a different direction. Like, we're looking forward now to Jesus' return. So we're facing east. We're not facing west, because we're living in now that sacred space and sacred time. And we know that God can't dwell in impure spaces, that the Spirit dwells only in purified and cleansed spaces. And so if the Spirit is dwelling in us, we must have been purified. And that's what Jesus' blood does. But Jesus' blood isn't just the purifying, it's also the blood of the new covenant. But it's all connected. In the words of Dirk Gently, if you watch that, everything is connected. So yes, Jesus is our Paschal Passover lamb that we get to participate in with a meal, but also it's a new covenant, and also it's the cleansing and removal and forgiveness of sins, and not our sins only, but the sins of the whole world and the world itself. So creation is being cleansed as well. And yeah, I think that's pretty amazing.
Amen.
I think for me, because my favorite word in just about every language I know and don't know probably is the word dwell, because there's so much richness, and that is the whole point of relationship and God's creation of man, was to have a relationship to dwell in. And all of Torah, all of garden to garden, how do we get back to dwelling with Yahweh the way we were intended to pre-fall? And these feasts and these festivals and the Eucharist now and gathering together and time, all of it is just, where a tagline from my channel is journey to dwell. This is just, to me, is so precious. And now being about the last 9 months or so, finding a church where I have found that kind of dwelling, slow relationship, deep community, and experience that in, I think, the way it was much more intended to be and to happen. It becomes an even more precious thing all the time, dwelling together, focused on relationship, dwelling with Christ. And that, to me, like, that's why Leviticus matters. It's that liturgy of dwelling together, vertically and horizontally, with God and with each other. That just I always circle back around to why Leviticus matters: dwelling with each other and dwelling with God. So, and that's kind of where I land on that one. So,
and then you tie into Passover, and it's dwelling in the
right,
place in which we were supposed to dwell,
right,
free, right, after
right.
being delivered. Like, yeah, so you have that connection into deliverance as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really beautiful picture. So, all right. So we're going to go back around the other way. Phil, where can people find you, and what is coming up for you lately in the near future here?
I'm on 4 weeks long service leave starting today, which is very, very exciting. Yeah, you can find me on my YouTube channel. Leviticus is fun. I am doing like an interview a week for the next 4 weeks, making the most of my long service leave. My book you can find everywhere. Leviticus on the Butcher's Block, which I'm also pretty excited about.
As
yeah.
you should be.
Yeah, that's me.
Yep. All right. Josh, where can people find you, and what have you got coming up?
I was like a deer in the headlights for a sec because I was like, wait, which order did we go in? Am I next or not? Yeah.
You were in the middle both times.
Oh, it's like
You're getting
shouldn't
covered
matter.
and going.
Oh man. So yeah, my podcast channel I have out there. Again, content from a few years ago, but looking at some new stuff. It's called Tending Our Nets, focused on the gospel. I also participate in a number of different forums, including this one and Faith Unaltered, and I occasionally Genesis Marks the Spot with Gary Griffel. I've also been on Ancient Faith Today with Father Tom Soroka a few times, so that's been an honor as well. And tonight I'll be doing Q&A live with the Two Trees podcast. They have a virtual conference that they have, and I did a lecture for that, and people will be asking me questions about the lecture I did, which was on finding Christ, the tree of life, in Romans 8-11. So that should be very fun.
Awesome. Yeah. And everybody's links are in the underneath down there in the description below, so you can go find them later. Courtney, what have you got coming up, and where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Kairos Classroom, our YouTube channel. You can also find me at kairosclassroom.com if you want to learn Greek or Hebrew, or reach out to me via email, Courtney@kairosclassroom.com. I have some experiences on faith, or like episodes on Faith Unaltered with you, Amber, our Hebrew Bible breakdown, and also some appearances on Cosmic Corner. I'm kind of like Sherman, like you get to randomly find me on whoever asked me to be on their channel that day. It's like less consistent than like, Phil having his own channel. So that's where I am, and I'll hopefully be, all things going to plan, starting a PhD this fall in Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. Really, like it'll kind of start in the Hebrew Bible but end in the New Testament, so it's kind of an intertextuality PhD. And so that should be fun. Yeah, I'll be starting that this fall. I feel like I'm already behind on the reading for that, so got to get started doing that.
All right, that's all good. That's all I would highly recommend. And I will, because he's not here, I will at least plug Spencer. Go check out Spencer's channel and his podcast, The Trauma Informed Church Kid. It is, and I could say this because he's not here now, it is probably my favorite YouTube channel. I love Spencer's content. It is good stuff, and I recommend it all the time. And I think Phil's got my second favorite YouTube channel. I love, it's a great introduction for people to Leviticus. It breaks it down into small, understandable chunks. They're not 2+ hours. You just need 5 to 10 minutes usually for Phil's videos. And so it's really good, digestible pieces. So, it's really good. And if you want to learn languages, Courtney is amazing. And so go do that. And and I haven't watched Josh's content yet, but I want to get around to that one of these days. I'm sure when I get done. So what's coming up on When Deep Calls Deep? So this is going to be really interesting because we got to finish up my Torah series, and we're going to talk about Torah and Jesus. And is there a connection? What is it? And it's going to get really interesting and a lot of fun, I think. So we're going to pull that one together. And then I'm going to be launching a series. We're going to walk through, I say we, but me. Well, I got some guest people coming on that I'm still lining up people to come do some of that stuff. But the first episode's coming out the second week of July. Warren McGrew is coming, and we are going to walk through the books of the Apocrypha, some of the pseudepigraphal books. So I think Warren and I are going to go through Jubilees, Tobit, and I can't remember the third one. But I think it's really important to, whether it's in your canon or not, to know what's in these books. So we're not going to do anything fancier than, oh, look, this is the story of Tobit, because Tobit, it is fun no matter what you do with it. It's just a fun book to read. It's crazy, and there's smoking fish guts, and it's good stuff. So, it's going to be, and so I'm taking a bunch of my favorites, and I'm just going to walk through the Apocryphal, talk about a few books at a time. And just so I think people are familiar with what's in them. So at least when these things come up in conversation, are we making statements about whether they belong in the canon or not? Nope. Absolutely not. We're just going to talk about what's in these books so people are at least familiar with them. And then that's going to be a lot of fun. And then I'm hoping to squeeze in one more thing before school starts in the fall. And then once school starts at the end of August, then my content will slow down quite a bit because I have a whale of a, a thesis topic that is going to be very, very tied. It's going to be really deeply tied into intertextuality, and we're going to get deep into biblical theology. And it's going to be really, if I can manage to pull it off, it's going to be an amazing dissertation once I get that far. But I have to get the thesis passed through first. So the amount of workload that's going to be involved there, and my program has this lovely thing where they're requiring people who are working on their thesis to teach their topic to undergrad. So I'm going to have to do some teaching to the, and I'm like not exactly thrilled about that part, but it's we'll see how it goes. And so I'm hoping to squeeze in, because I've been wanting to do an Ezekiel series for quite a while, and it's kind of been in cooking and development. I just haven't had the time to devote to it because Ezekiel is my favorite book, and it is a squirrely monster, but it is absolutely a blast and a lot of fun to do. And then I've got a few individual episodes that are going to be coming out because I'm going to talk about the Aramaic donut hole in Jeremiah. So that I might be, Courtney, I might be hitting you up to come talk about the Aramaic donut hole in Jeremiah, because that's a really fun topic to get into. Definitely have some plans. I'm going to do another thing on Genesis 1, because I've been binge consuming Andrew Teeter lately as part of my research for looking at some stuff for my thesis. So I want to do something with that. Like there's just some individual fun things going to be kind of floating out here in the next couple of months. It's going to be, I'm going to have fun with. People can watch it or not. That's fine. It's just mostly, this is just for me to have fun with. And then we'll have some more of these Why Leviticus Matters videos coming out. I think we've got like 7 of
Can
them.
we tease next time?
Next time, well, if I could remember what it
I'm
is.
very, very excited about. Are we talking about
do.
the priests, the Levites being taken
Yes.
from among the Israelites in the place of the Israelites, and that whole thing of all the firstborn are mine, so I'll take the Levites. I'm very excited about this episode.
Nice.
Yeah, we're definitely getting in, diving deep into the priesthood, and I'm sure there's a lot of fun to be had there, and I'm expecting Sherman to show up with a lot of Hebrews ready to go from the book of Hebrews.
It's substitution. It's biblical substitution.
There's a lot of really good stuff in there with the priests and the priesthood, and we're just gonna. I'm actually really excited. It was like when you said that, I was like, oh crap, what's next? I don't remember because we had so many like trying to settle on whatever. So yeah, priests and priesthood coming next. That's going to be a lot of fun, and we're eventually gonna. I think the last one of. However, I'm going to pull a Nathan Jacobs here and say the last one of this series that has no number at this point is going to all be about Leviticus is really about Jesus at the end. So that's kind of where we're headed eventually here, but we're going to have fun playing with the rabbit trails on our way to get to that point. So thank you everybody for sticking with us. This was another long one. We're a little over 2.5 hours. So for those of you who made it through the whole thing, thank you very much. Those of you who came and went, thank you very much for that as well. And I really hope that you are as blessed as these videos as we have been putting these together, and enjoy having these conversations and talking about this stuff, because it is a lot of fun and it does matter. Leviticus matters almost as much as Ezekiel does. So with that, we will say thank you, God bless, and every day don't forget to journey to dwell closer with Yahweh.